Yo legends, welcome back to the channel. Grab your headphones and lock in because today's story is on another level. Want the next chapter? Drop a comment below, and if the legend continues, I'm bringing it straight to you. Disclaimer, I do not claim ownership of this story. All rights belong to the original creators. Note, I'm constantly tweaking the settings to make it as immersive as possible. Marvel, the Imposter Inventor. Chapter 1, What If? Chapter 1, What if a soul, who shouldn't belong here, were to appear in the Marvel Universe? Midtown Manhattan, New York, 2012. Inside an ordinary two-story apartment of only about 500 square meters on Fifth Avenue. A handsome chestnut-haired boy, about 14 or 5 years old, was drawing something with chalk on the oak floor of his bedroom. The boy wore a casual white shirt. He was tall and slender, with delicate and well-defined features, and wore a pair of half-rimmed gold-rimmed glasses. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting dappled shadows on the boy's profile. Combined with the cozy interior decor, the scene created a tranquil and refreshing atmosphere. Apart from the boy's obviously disproportionate black mechanical right arm, peeking out from under his right sleeve, was now emitting a faint, creaking sound as he painted. However, compared to the somewhat noisy mechanical arm, the circles of magic circles that the boy was drawing on the ground, which resembled an evil ritual, seemed even more out of place with the surrounding environment. Okay, that should be about right. Next up are the ingredients. He casually tossed the chalk down before the boy could do anything else. From the living room downstairs, one could faintly hear a middle-aged couple arguing in hushed tones. Gina, you should at least have discussed this with me beforehand. We've already left Sokovia and gotten rid of those people. Now you're offering yourself up to them again, seeking cooperation. You're practically pushing the company into a fire pit. As he spoke, the middle-aged man was trying his best to suppress his tone, but he still couldn't hide his anger. In contrast, the mature and beautiful middle-aged woman opposite him spoke in an unusually calm and cold tone. Herman, times have changed. These days, you can't make a living off 1 or 2 inventions and a few patents. I can wait, but will the shareholders wait for you? Having lost orders from both Stark Industries and Hammer Industries, the company simply cannot survive if it does not make changes as soon as possible. I don't care what you think. Even if it's just for Luca's future quality of life, I have to save the company. Hearing his wife's resolute words, the middle-aged man named Herman wanted to speak several times, but he didn't know how to refute her, so he could only try to argue his own point. Although the arguing downstairs was getting louder and louder, to the point where it was impossible to ignore, the boy in the bedroom upstairs just shook his head helplessly and had no intention of trying to stop it. It's not that the boy was cold-hearted or didn't care about family harmony. However, having only recently transmigrated to this world and spent nearly 2 months in the hospital, he was simply unable to properly sort out his current family relationships. Luca von Orange, what your original name was, is no longer important. In his past life, he had once again helped the police dismantle a large fraud ring. On his way home, he was hit head-on by a large truck loaded with sand and gravel. His last sight before dying was of a large truck, possibly there to take revenge on him, crashing relentlessly into an apartment building on the side of the road. When Luca opened his eyes again, he had transmigrated into the body of a boy who had also died tragically in a car accident. Perhaps it was the god of time travel who exerted his divine power, or perhaps it was Luca's soul that nourished this body. After several days of emergency treatment, although he lost his entire right arm below the elbow, his body eventually pulled through. Now, nearly 2 months have passed, and the memories are gradually merging. Luca, who was a loner in his previous life, is slowly accepting this new family with both parents and a wealthy background. At least in this world, I still have a happy family, don't I? Since coming into this world, Luca has always comforted himself with this thought. However, compared to this happy family, the world itself is not so wonderful. During his nearly 2-month hospital stay, aside from merging memories, the few things Luca could do were watch TV in his hospital room. And that billionaire who travels the world every day in his flamboyant armor to fight crime is naturally the most frequently featured news figure on television. Having watched plenty of Marvel movies in his previous life, Luca naturally knew what kind of world he was in. However, the Marvel universe is known for having many parallel universes, so he is not sure whether the future will develop as he remembers it. Fortunately, Iron Man is currently the only superhero who is widely recognized in the public consciousness, so the world hasn't turned into a state where ordinary people can't afford to live. Of course, another reason that allowed Luca to relax for the time being was, having traveled through time, he also possesses his own cheat-like abilities. Looking at the circle drawn on the ground that resembled some kind of evil ritual, Luca took out an ordinary red sneaker from the box next to him. However, what seemed like an ordinary sneaker to others appeared to Luca as not only emitting a faint white light, but also displaying a pale blue text panel when he held it in his hand. Shoes to enhance leg strength. Detective Conan World 1-5. Manufacturer, Professor Agasa. Core component, red and white sneakers. Composite consumables, 0.5 meter long electrical cord, 6 medical shock pads, 1 small knob, 1 small battery. Item description, amazing leg strengthening shoes that enhance leg strength through electric shock stimulation of acupoints. Level 1, kick a person in the head. Level 2, destroy a vehicle. Level 3, destroy a satellite. Immense power without harming the feet, 100% accurate and harmless. An essential gadget for home, travel, and crime fighting. Friendly reminder, these shoes are durable, breathable, and odor-resistant, as verified by a famous detective who hasn't changed his shoes in 30 years. Yes, this is the cheat code Luca gained after transmigrating. Luca, who had been lying in a hospital ward for nearly 2 months, tried various methods to awaken things like the system and the old man, but ultimately failed. This led him to believe that he didn't have any cheat codes at all, and that he could only struggle to survive by relying on his limited precognitive knowledge of the Marvel Universe. To his surprise, after returning home from the hospital, he discovered that a pencil case he had once used was now emitting a faint glow that only he could see. After touching the pencil case, a whole bunch of random information popped up, including world of origin, manufacturer, and synthetic consumables. The item from the One Punch Man world, called Pencil Missile, was recently synthesized by Luca using a series of inexplicable things such as pencil, gunpowder, glue, and gun grip. As for the strength-enhancing shoes, it is the second craftable item that Luca discovered, an ordinary pair of sneakers from an ordinary shoe store. Luca hasn't fully understood the various abilities of this cheat system yet. For example, what does 1-5 after Detective Conan World mean? For example, why does a pattern resembling a magic circle pop into my head after I come into contact with the core components? For example, why is it that after drawing the same magic circle a second time, using the same brand of pencil box and materials, it is impossible to continue to create new pencil missiles? However, at least the most basic, synthesis, function has been roughly figured out. He placed the red and white sneakers in the center of the circle, and then placed the other items in their corresponding smaller circles. These items, which were originally made of ordinary materials, immediately began to emit a similar faint glow, just like the red and white sneakers that were called the core components. No AA batteries will do, not even small military-grade batteries. After trying several different batteries, it wasn't until a regular button battery bought from the supermarket was placed in the array that the white light finally enveloped it. If even a vibrating toy can't power a button battery, how can it really power these leg-strengthening shoes? Quickly shaking off the random thoughts in his mind, Luca placed his hands back on the edge of the circular array, silently chanting in his mind. Synthesis. Immediately afterwards, the golden light surged and completely engulfed the entire circular array. After the light completely dissipated, all the other materials in the circular array had disappeared, leaving only a pair of brand new red and white sneakers in the center of the array. Just why are these shoes so much too small? Looking at the red and white sneakers in front of him, which were barely bigger than his own hand, Luca was speechless. Could it be that these stamina-enhancing shoes are only for elementary school students? As they were talking, Luca stepped forward and picked up the sneakers, which were clearly several sizes smaller than the original ones. To everyone's surprise, the moment the shoes were in hand, they seemed to have a sensory function, immediately enlarging several sizes, as if they were exactly the size Luca usually wore. Luca examined the shoe closely. The entire shoe was perfectly made, except for a white knob on the outside of the right foot. It was no different from an ordinary sneaker. Even inside the shoes, there was no trace of batteries, wires, or electrical contacts. If it weren't for that sudden change in size, one might even think that the red and white sneakers without the synthetic panel are just an ordinary pair of shoes. After hesitating for a moment, Luca ultimately decided against using tools to disassemble and inspect the shoes. He did take out 2 missiles from the pencil missile before, intending to keep them to try and reconstruct something similar later. But this shoe is a one-piece design, and it's known for its illogical and high-tech features. If he were to take it apart haphazardly, given his limited theoretical knowledge and practical skills, he definitely wouldn't be able to put it back together. It's better to just wear them and test their performance directly. By the way, normally speaking, wouldn't kicking things with these shoes break my leg? With that thought in mind, Luca quickly put on his shoes, using his not-so-flexible mechanical right hand. Unfortunately, only the right foot has a pressure adjustment knob, making it difficult for me to use my right hand normally. It would be great if we came across some kind of high-tech arm or similar gadget later. Feeling the discomfort in his right hand, Luca tried moving his feet and stood up again. Just as he was thinking about whether to tell his parents that he would go downstairs to find something to kick a couple of times. Suddenly, several rapid whooshing sounds came from outside the window. Looking somewhat puzzled, Luca quickly walked to the bedroom window and peered outside. I saw it right away. In the distance, a blue beam of light shot straight into the sky, and at the very top of that beam, the sky appeared to have been pierced by a giant hole. Countless aliens in armor-riding airships flew out of that hole and then wreaked havoc in New York. Even more impressively, a biological warship, over 100 meters long and resembling a mythical leviathan, hurtled down from the sky, crashing into and collapsing buildings one after another. On the ground, people screamed and cried for help in panic. Beams of light from alien guns rained down, triggering a series of explosions. The whole of New York seemed to have fallen into a living hell. All these observations converge into one answer. The Chitauri have invaded. End of this chapter. Chapter 2, A Little Invention. Chapter 2, A Little Invention, Luca. Looking at the hellish scene outside the window, even Luca, who had seen his share of storms in his previous life, couldn't help but feel fear when faced with the real alien invasion. However, the anxious shouts from his parents downstairs made him immediately realize that he had to do something. However, before Luca could even respond to his parents' calls, in their line of sight, a deep purple beam of light shot rapidly toward their location. Next moment, boom! The violent explosion sent Luca flying. The towering flames filled the sky, and the entire building trembled violently from the explosion. When Luca's body slammed into the wardrobe behind him, the first thing he felt was not the pain from the impact. Instead, there was a piercing buzzing sound and a strong feeling of dizziness filling my brain. In a daze, Luca braced himself against the overturned desk beside him and struggled to stand up. Looking up, the most striking thing in one's line of sight is the huge hole that has been blown open in the exterior wall of one's duplex apartment, running from one floor to the other. Including Luca's own bedroom, nearly half of the entire second-floor floor has collapsed down to the first floor. Smoke and dust filled the air. The strong smell of gunpowder filled the air. Large chunks of brick and stone debris kept sliding down. Luca, whose hearing had not yet fully recovered, disregarded the dust in his mouth and immediately shouted out his parents' names. Gina, Herman, are you both all right? However, no matter how much Luca called out, there was no answer from the ruins of the house. Although Luca, who is a transmigrator who only inherited the original body's memories, may not have had a very deep relationship with his parents. But whether for his own sake or for the sake of his family, he did not want his parents to be in any danger. Without thinking twice, Luca quickly opened the wardrobe behind him, took out his backpack, and put it on. Immediately afterwards, they slid down the collapsed slope at high speed. Luca, who had just arrived on the first floor, was faced with a scene of devastation. Before he could even begin his search, he saw two roaring Zeta Swiss soldiers crawling out of a huge hole in his wall and charging toward him. At this point, it seemed too late for Luca to take out the pencil missile from his backpack or crouch down to activate the strength-enhancing shoes. However, bang bang, two loud gunshots rang out behind me. Immediately afterwards, the heads of the two Zeta Swiss soldiers in front of them exploded like watermelons, with chunks of flesh and juices splattering everywhere. Seeing the two headless corpses lying on the ground, Luca turned around. Amidst the ruins, his mother Gina was leaning against the doorframe, struggling to look at him. In her hand was a high-powered firearm that her own company was still experimenting with. "Mom, where's Dad?" He rushed forward to help his mother. It was only then that Luca noticed that behind the door frame that Gina was holding onto, her entire lower body was still pressed against the collapsed wall. Fortunately, the collapsed wall formed a slight angle with the other rubble, which prevented Gina from dying immediately after being trapped under the debris. On the other side of the ruins, Luca reached out to find that Herman, the father who had also been hit by rubble, had already stopped breathing. Ignoring what his mother was saying, Luca immediately bent down and tried to move the wall that Gina was pressing against. However, this mechanical prosthetic limb that he had just been fitted with was not the military mechanical arm like the Winter Soldiers. Its strength is even less than that of a normal person's healthy right hand, let alone moving such a huge rock. Luca, listen to me. Now take this gun. Your mom and dad have taught you how to use it. Don't worry about me. Find somewhere to hide. The storage room in the house is specially reinforced. Stay there. Don't come out. Watching Luca's futile attempt to move the stones, Gina, who had just recovered from the shock of the explosion and was still somewhat delirious, quickly gave her son instructions. Looking at the strangely shaped pistol handed to him, Luca only then noticed that the pistol was also emitting the kind of fluorescent white light that only core components could produce. However, Luca did not take the pistol immediately. Instead, the white light emanating from the pistol reminded him. These power-enhancing shoes seemed to do more than just boost burst power. The thought flashed through my mind like lightning. Luca immediately crouched down and used his left hand to turn the white knob on the outside of his right foot. Immediately afterwards, a visible arc of electricity flashed across the red and white sneakers, and the entire right foot seemed to be coated with a layer of colorful light. Feeling an unprecedented surge of power coursing through his right leg, Luca carefully inserted his toes into the crevice of the ruins. As he slowly exerted force with his right leg, the collapsed wall, which he had been unable to move even an inch despite using all his strength, was easily lifted up by one leg under this tremendous force. Even during this process, Luca didn't feel much pressure or discomfort on the instep of his right foot. Even the left foot, which wasn't powered, seemed to have its grip and support increased several times over, so there was no need to worry about balance or anything like that. Under Gina's astonished gaze, there was a boom. The massive stone ruins were completely overturned and pushed aside. Luca reacted quickly, grabbing his mother and pulling her away from the spot. "Luca, what's that?" Gina, still somewhat shaken, was no longer confused. She just stared blankly at the huge rock that her son had kicked away with one foot. However, when asked by her, Luca could only give a vague answer with a hint of embarrassment. "It's just one of my little inventions." He couldn't explain the concept of a golden finger in a short time, so he simply glossed over it and prepared to take his mother to the storage room she had mentioned earlier for refuge. It's best not to linger here at this time, lest another Chitauri attack reach this area. But before Luca could even help Gina take a few steps out, they were already gone. A figure clad in gold and red armor plummeted from the sky, passing through a large hole in the outer wall and crashed heavily into the house with a thud. The already dilapidated ground was immediately smashed into a shallow pit, and the figure also plowed a long trench in the ground, splashing up a lot of gravel, and slid straight to the two people before just stopping. Seeing Iron Man suddenly descend from the sky, the mother and son, who had just calmed down a bit, were both startled and simultaneously drew their weapons, aiming at the figure lying on the ground in front of them. However, Gina pulled out a prototype pistol developed by her own company, while Luca pulled out a pencil missile that he had made himself and had previously kept in his backpack. "Oh, relax, relax, ma'am. I don't think this should be considered trespassing." Tony Stark, seeing himself being held at gunpoint, showed no sign of nervousness. He simply stood up somewhat awkwardly and gently comforted the two of them. However, his electronically synthesized voice, after being transformed by the armor mask, sounded somewhat cold and distorted. Seemingly noticing this problem, Iron Man's metal mask snapped open, revealing Tony Stark's face, who continued to soothe the mother and son before him. "Relax, you two. Find somewhere to hide quickly. Trust me, those fake predators outside will be taken care of soon." As he spoke, Tony Stark winked at Luca and gave what he thought was a cool smile. "And kid, remember next time, a pencil case can't protect you." After saying this, the metal mask fell down again. Iron Man immediately turned around, flames shooting from his hands and feet simultaneously, and flew rapidly outwards along the hole in the wall he had crashed into. Just boom! A loud explosion. The steel armor had barely flown 2 meters out of the room when it was struck squarely in the face by a laser beam that shot straight at it. The explosion's flames and shockwave blasted it away. In an instant, Iron Man tumbled back at an even faster speed than when he left. It crashed down in front of the mother and child again. Immediately afterwards, several Chitauri hovercrafts arrived quickly, floating around the house, with 2 or 3 Chitauri soldiers standing on each hovercraft. More than a dozen laser weapons were all pointed at the hole in the room. The mother and son, who were also startled by the explosion, first covered their faces with their hands to shield themselves from the dust and sand brought by the shock wave. Then, without prior arrangement, they all quickly raised their weapons and aimed them at the Chitauri hovering outside their houses. Gina, who launched the first attack, shot one of the Chitauri drivers in the head off. Luca, wielding the pencil missile, was a beat slower. Suddenly, the lids on both sides of the pencil case in Luca's hand popped open, revealing missiles inside that resembled pencils. Meanwhile, gun components resembling grips and muzzles protrude from the bottom and front of the pencil case, respectively. Luca, gripping the gun handle with his left hand, didn't even aim. He simply swept the pencil missile across all the enemies in front of him. The beeping sounds, signaling the lock to be engaged, rang out in succession, and Luca pulled the trigger without hesitation. Swish swish tilde. More than a dozen pencil-sized missiles spewed out large plumes of flame from their rear ends, twisting and turning in the air like serpents as they flew toward their respective locked targets. In an instant, all the Chitauri were hit by bullets. However, the expected violent explosion did not occur. Instead, all the missiles exploded into a large amount of sticky liquid the moment they hit their targets, completely covering the enemies. Having lost their sight and being stuck and unable to move, the airships immediately began to wobble and plummet towards the ground. Wardfa. End of this chapter. Chapter 3 warning. Warning. Chapter 3 warning. Warning, Tony Stark was immediately brought back to his senses after hearing a series of airship explosions downstairs. When those dozen or so missiles flew past him all at once, even he, dressed in a suit of armor, couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. Fortunately, these missiles did not explode upon hitting the enemy. Instead, they burst out into clumps of slime that bound the enemy, which relieved him slightly. Even so, his astonishment did not diminish in the slightest. Jarvis just now. Hearing Tony Stark's hesitant inquiry. As an intelligent butler, Jarvis, whose database already contains numerous behavioral and habitual records of its owner, immediately understood what Tony Stark wanted to ask. Inside the Iron Man suit's visor, A virtual aperture immediately locked onto the pencil box in Luca's hand, and a large amount of data emerged from the side. Meanwhile, Jarvis's voice system also provided the answer. Sir, no weapon source was found in the database at the moment. The system analysis result is a miniature handheld missile launcher. It has an intelligent locking function, and the launched missile is filled with a sticky polymer, which has a strong effect on trapping the enemy. However, the missiles fly relatively slowly, and at medium to long ranges, the Mark armor has a 98.4% probability of intercepting them all. Overall, the threat level to you is low. Tony Stark, who had stood up again, felt that his sudden outburst had been somewhat unseemly, and he was still a little dazed. Then just now, Tony Stark was trying to say that, when he first crashed into the mother and child, he was clearly pointed at in the face by that miniature missile bay, which hardly counted as mid-range. Furthermore, the Mark armor's scanning function itself has a certain degree of penetration, allowing it to perform analysis even before the pencil box is unfolded. Why didn't Jarvis warn him of the danger he was in? However, before he could even finish speaking, Jarvis anticipated his problem and gave him a warning. Sir, your action of voluntarily unfolding your mask just now interrupted the system analysis. Tony Stark blushed upon hearing this, realizing that his own mistake had caused him to embarrass himself. Even so, Tony Stark remained defiant. Minor issue. Jarvis, remind me later to add an external obstacle removal function to the armor's self-cleaning system. Yes, sir. After receiving Jarvis's affirmative reply, Tony Stark originally planned to remind the mother and son to be careful and then leave quickly. After all, the great battle outside is still raging. Compared to saving face, resolving the current crisis as quickly as possible and saving more citizens is the most important thing right now. However, before he could even speak, the boy who had just put away the pencil case suddenly accelerated, speeding past him at an incredible pace and rushing towards the hole in the room. The boy sprinted at an extremely fast speed, but it was still far from exceeding the visual scanning limit of the Iron Man suit. Tony Stark turned around and immediately noticed that the boy suddenly brachied and stopped abruptly as he rushed toward a soccer ball near the hole. At the same time, he raised his right leg high behind him, stretching out his whole body like an eagle, his eyes fixed on the distance. In the direction the boy was gazing, a 100-meter-long Leviathan alien spaceship was slowly approaching the building where the house was located from a distance. Along the way, Chitauri soldiers kept leaping out of the Leviathan warships and bounding towards the ground. What is he going to do? Warning, warning, high-energy reaction. Scan results, unknown electrical energy module, memory polymer metal mimicking muscle fibers, magnetofluid damping layer filling, carbon nanocrystalline fiber. Data streams flashed across the faceplate, and Jarvis's warnings echoed in my ears. However, Tony Stark's attention was completely drawn to the boy who had raised his leg high. Suddenly, a burst of electric sparks erupted from the boy's right foot, with faint streaks of iridescent light flashing across the shoe's surface. The next moment, Luca unleashed a powerful shot that struck the ball in front of him. In the slow-motion view of the Mark armor, the entire football twists and changes shape. The air around the sphere was compressed, producing a huge popping sound. With this terrifying force fully released, the football shot out like a fiery meteor. A powerful blast of air swept up a large amount of building debris, churning it forward. The surface of the soccer ball rubbed against the air, creating an orange-red halo, trailing a comet-like tail of flame. A series of sonic booms exploded along the trajectory of the football. The glass facades of high-rise buildings, located close to the path of the football, were all shattered. Boom! With a tremendous explosion, the football that pierced the sky slammed solidly into the Leviathan warship. The biological warship immediately emitted a painful groan. Under the immense force of the impact, the metal armor on the outer side of the warship exploded instantly at the point where the football hit. The entire warship stumbled backward uncontrollably in midair. Unknown external material reinforcement technology. Unknown locking system. Unknown. Jarvis's analysis and report are still ongoing. But right now, Tony Stark just stood there, stunned, swallowing hard. "Oh, I thank you." Roar. The roar broke Tony Stark's daze. Luca's spectacular and violent football looked fierce, and in reality, it was also very powerful. However, compared to the enormous size of the Leviathan warship, it was still somewhat inferior. Now that the Leviathan had readjusted its posture, it charged straight toward the building at an even faster speed than before. Without time to think, Tony Stark immediately activated his mark armor and shot off like a meteor. Fortunately, Luca's attack had already shattered part of the Leviathan's armor, saving Stark the trouble of breaking through its defenses. A wrist-mounted missile was swiftly launched, striking the exposed muscle tissue of the biological warship. Boom! Another loud explosion rang out. A large hole was instantly torn open in the body of the Leviathan behemoth. It then swayed and crashed to the ground with a mournful cry, finally dying completely after smashing through 2 more buildings. Few tilde it actually worked tilde. Tony Stark, hovering in midair, whistled excitedly. Unexpectedly, with the help of that soccer player, the alien warship that had previously given him a headache was dealt with so easily. But what kind of family is that, to equip a child with something like this? Weapon. End of this chapter, Chapter 4 Dominator, Chapter 4 Dominator. Although Tony was full of questions at this moment, he really wanted to turn around and look at that football boy. However, the voice communication coming through the mask quickly drew his attention back to the battlefield. "Stark, we need your support on 6th Avenue. Another alien troop transport ship has appeared there." "Got it, I'll be right there." Following Hawkeye Clint Barton's instructions, Tony didn't hesitate for a moment and immediately turned and flew towards 6th Avenue. However, the communication in his ear did not end, and Hawkeye took the initiative to ask when he saw him set off. "By the way, what was that streak of light just now? A new feature of your armor. It looked pretty powerful." "Hey, Robin Hood, focus on your battlefield observation work." When Hawkeye expressed interest in the spectacular attack from earlier, Tony chose not to give a direct answer. It's not that he, as a man of Stark's stature, wanted to take credit for this achievement. However, recalling the obviously young appearance of the pencil box boy, he was clearly not very old. Tony Stark also did not want to involve the other party in this war. Even if the other party might be of some help in dealing with other alien warships. Well, especially since Clint Barton also has the identity of a SHIELD agent, he's even less likely to tell the other party this outright. Let's return our attention to the room with the hole. Watching Iron Man's armor spew flames and disappear into the distance, Luca wasn't particularly surprised. After all, Manhattan is now full of invading Chitauri, and a key figure like Tony Stark probably doesn't have much time to care about the minor anomalies of a passerby like himself. Instead of Tony Stark's departure, Luca was more concerned about the strength-enhancing shoes that he had only recently synthesized. I turned off the knob at my ankle and moved my right foot, which had suddenly lost its strength, a little. Not to mention the recoil injury caused by such a powerful kick. Luca didn't even feel any muscle soreness or anything like that caused by overexertion. It really is a Detective Conan prop. Those special effects, wow, no wonder it's the ultimate cool show tool for the Detective Conan movie. In fact, it's not just about power and leg protection. Logically speaking, given the force of Luca's kick just now, even if he wasn't injured by the reaction force. However, his left foot, which hadn't received the electric acupoint enhancement, was probably insufficient to support him while he could still stand steadily in place during a shot. However, in reality, at the same time as that kick, Luca's left leg did not feel any pressure beyond its limit. It was as if he had just kicked a regular soccer ball. What's even more outrageous is that Luca is hardly a football enthusiast, let alone hitting a target accurately from hundreds of meters away. Even if he were given an open goal just a dozen meters away, he wouldn't dare say he'd hit it 100%. This instantly reminded Luca of the description on the panel when he synthesized the strength enhancement shoes. Powerful yet harmless to the feet, with perfect accuracy and no injury. It seems that no matter how hard or how much force Conan kicks, he only ever knocks people unconscious. Looks like I'll have to pay more attention to the item descriptions on the panel in the future. Unfortunately, after the item was synthesized, even Luca himself could no longer see the panel information. He could only consider researching his cheat system after obtaining the core components of other items. Putting these matters aside for the time being, Luca glanced at the battle situation outside and immediately turned back. He had originally planned to discuss with his mother, Gina, whether the two of them should temporarily hide in the storage room they had mentioned earlier, or go out to take refuge. After all, they didn't live on the first floor. If another Leviathan warship were to strike, causing the house to collapse, even the most sturdy storage room wouldn't be able to protect them. However, when he turned around, he found that Gina had fallen to the ground at some point, and the high-tech pistol in her hand had also fallen to the ground. He rushed to Gina in 2 quick steps and reached out to check her breath. His breathing is steady, his heartbeat and pulse are normal, there are no obvious injuries on his head, and his cervical spine seems fine. After thinking for a moment, Luca pried open Gina's eyelids again to confirm that her pupil photosensitivity was normal. Luca breathed a slight sigh of relief, realizing that the person had probably just fainted. So far, so good. Luca had previously remarked that at least he was born with both parents. If he had only been in this world for a few days, and then an accident left him all alone again, he would really start to doubt his fate. Just thinking about my experiences from childhood to adulthood in my past, life lets save the living first. With this in mind, Luca recalled the original owner's memories and quickly pulled out the first aid kit that was always kept at home. Fortunately, the first aid kit was intact and the contents were not damaged. They immediately gave Gina's mother a simple bandage. However, even the pain during the bandaging process, coupled with Luca's attempts at several relatively safe methods of waking Gina, failed to rouse her from her coma. For a moment, he didn't know how to continue the treatment. Firstly, his limited first aid knowledge prevented him from determining the specific cause of the unconsciousness, which could lead to further injury. Furthermore, given the current situation outside, it's unlikely that we'll be able to get any help, so it's better to just wait here patiently. From what I recall, this Chitauri invasion shouldn't last too long. Whether you can survive until professional medical personnel arrive is entirely up to fate. Luca shook his head helplessly. After he had done everything he could, he remembered. The experimental pistol that the mother used before seemed to also emit the faint white light unique to the core components. He looked around and picked up the pistol he had forgotten about. A light blue panel immediately popped up above the gun. Dominator pistol, basic type. Psychopass World 1-5. Manufacturer, Sibylla. Core component, ion confinement pistol. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter 1, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. 1 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter 1 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter 1 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter 30 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. LED Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Item description: an excellent multifunctional police transforming pistol. It has 3 different modes: non-lethal tranquilizer mode, lethal elimination mode, and destructive destroyer mode. After connecting to the Sybil system, it has multiple functions such as voice interaction, user recognition, enemy information scanning, and retinal projection assistance. Friendly reminder: without access to the Sybil system, some functions will be temporarily unavailable. However, this might be good news for you. During the new book period, I will guarantee 2 chapters a day, but I will try to write more and save up some exciting plot points for when the book is released. Please continue to support me, bookmark this page, and follow along. Thanks. End of this chapter. Chapter 5, Is This Reasonable? Chapter 5, Is This Reasonable? His gaze swept over the information on the panel. Then he looked at the unpainted metal-cased pistol in his hand. A strange expression flashed across Luca's face. He had previously felt that this prototype pistol, manufactured by his own company, looked somewhat familiar. However, now that the panel has shown the Dominator pistol, he feels that the pistol and the Dominator in the anime are only about 20% or 30% similar. So, the so-called core components are not determined by their appearance. Furthermore, this time the composite material didn't mention energy devices or ammunition. Is it because these are already included in the core components of these parts? Various thoughts flashed through his mind, but in the end, Luca suppressed his desire to explore for the time being. After all, even if he wanted to continue trying to synthesize it now, he couldn't currently gather all the necessary materials for the Dominator pistol at home. It's impossible that he'd use his brick-sized TV projector instead of the miniature projection device that's advertised on the panel, right? I glanced at the battery level indicator displayed on the handle of the ion beam pistol. Gina had only fired 3 shots, yet she already had only 1 bar of battery left. This is why, despite the pistol's considerable power, near-zero recoil, and minimal ion beam attenuation at medium range, it can still only be considered a semi-finished experimental product. Insufficient energy resources and poor sustained combat capability. Yes, the high cost is probably one of the reasons. He tucked the pistol into his pocket. Although the Dominator pistol couldn't be crafted for the time being, there seemed to be materials available for another item on the spot. Luca took off his backpack and rummaged through it. He took out a monkey toy with a rather strange shape. The toy has 2 somewhat comical-looking symbols in its hands and a huge wind-up key on its back. A semi-transparent blue panel also popped up on the monkey toy I received. Exploding little monkey bomb battle of 2 cities world 1/5 created by, boom core component, toy monkey crafting materials, 3 unstable energy crystals item description, a simple yet powerful toy bomb. Its power relies entirely on 3 Hextech crystals. After being wound up, it becomes unstable and timers. It has slow, short-range movement capabilities. It explodes by repeatedly striking the unstable Hextech crystals, offering no safety guarantees. Friendly reminder. Dear customer, please make sure there are no friends or family members within the blast radius before using the bomb. That's right. This toy from the original owner's childhood is also a core component that can be synthesized. Even the synthetic consumables are surprisingly simple, requiring only 1 material. However, before this, Luca didn't even know what kind of crystal in the real world could be called an unstable energy crystal. Since the only material is nowhere to be found, the so-called synthesis is naturally out of the question. Fortunately, this is not the ordinary real world. Looking at the 2 headless Chitauri corpses in his home, a fiery glint flashed in Luca's eyes. If he remembers correctly, in Marvel's Spider-Man movies, the villain Vulture acquired a lot of high-tech weapons by recycling and modifying items left behind by the Chitauri. The purple energy crystals most commonly found on the Chitauri are extremely unstable and can even explode after passing through an X-ray security checkpoint. This purple crystal should meet the requirements for crafting the panel. Time to get started. Taking a few quick steps to the headless corpse, ignoring the bloody mess on the ground, Luca immediately began examining the body and weapons. Both Chitauri were equipped with ordinary folding beam guns, which were not very powerful and had a relatively compact structure. Although it emitted a purple light, he couldn't figure out how to disassemble it in a short time. However, compared to more complex weapons and armor, the gleaming embedded crystal on the back of the Chitauri's hand seemed to be telling him that there was absolutely no need for such trouble. After failing to pry the purple crystal off, Luca simply picked up the Chitauri's folding beam gun and used its bladed side to slash at the Chitauri corpse's wrist. 2 Chitauri corpses, 4 hands, and 4 purple crystals. Luca thought for a moment and then stopped trying to pry the crystal with the blade. Instead, he drew a circular magic circle on the ground. The monkey toy, which serves as the core component, is placed in the center of the circle, while the other 3 Chitauri hands, each inlaid with purple crystals, are placed in one of the 3 corners. Sure enough, the 3 purple crystals began to emit a faint white light one after another. It's done. Without the slightest hesitation, Luca placed his hands on the edge of the circular array and silently chanted, "Synthesis." Immediately afterwards, the light intensified, and the circular array in front of us was instantly enveloped. When the light disappeared, a strangely shaped toy monkey, with a blue spherical crystal hanging between two symbols and two identical crystals stuffed inside its body, has appeared in the center of the magic circle. The purple crystals that were originally embedded on the backs of the three aliens have disappeared, leaving only the neatly cut palms in place. The purple crystal turned into a blue crystal. Luca had previously thought that this was the simplest item, and that after combining it, he might just need to polish the crystal and place it in the right spot. It seems that no matter what materials I use, the items I synthesize will always revert to the original appearance of the work. The original Chitauri purple crystals have been transformed into blue Hextech crystals. Why is Luca so certain at this moment? The little monkey bomb, which possesses 3 blue crystals, was once again emitting a unique pale white glow from one of its crystals, characteristic of a core component. Carefully pick up the little monkey bomb, unscrew the detachable head, open it, and take out the Hextech crystal that emits a faint glow. The light blue panel reappeared. Hextech Core Battle of Two Cities World 2/5 Manufacturer. Victor Core Component. Hextech Crystal Crafting Materials. 1 stable small reactor, 4 different magic runes item description. A stable and sustainable energy source imbued with magical power, representing the pinnacle of Hextech aesthetics. It possesses inexhaustible energy and the ability to enable the glorious evolution of living beings, provided that your body and mind possess the capacity to resist the corrosive power of arcane and runic magic. Friendly reminder: if you don't want to destroy the world or yourself, it's recommended to avoid contact with any biological tissue. Looking at the panel that suddenly appeared, it mentioned endless energy and glorious evolution. Luca only had one question to ask. Is this reasonable? End of this chapter, Chapter 6, You Shouldn't and #039T have revealed your identity. Chapter 6, You Shouldn't have revealed your identity. As Luca played with the Hextech crystal in his hand, he seemed to have gained a better understanding of the crafting rules for his cheat abilities. It seems that no matter what unrelated materials are used, as long as they meet the name, requirements of the crafting materials on the panel, the final crafted item will be consistent with the original. Whether its appearance, efficacy, or even some highly unscientific conceptual functions. However, the concept of a golden finger, or cheat code, doesn't really have any scientific basis, so Luca doesn't find it unacceptable. It's a bit of a shame that Hextech Core seems to be another item that can't be crafted in the short term. The only stable small reactor Luca could think of was the arc reactor in Tony Stark's chest, which he treasured dearly. Ordinary people would have virtually no chance of getting their hands on it. The other material, 4 different magical runes, is even further away from Luca. It's estimated that it can only be obtained in places like Camertage or Asgard. Both synthetic materials were too far away, so Luca could only carefully put away the Hextech crystal that emitted white light for the time being. As for the remaining monkey bombs, these might be the only 3 Hextech crystals in the world. Using them solely as bombs seems a bit wasteful. Although that's what he thought, Luca still didn't take out the remaining 2 crystals separately. After all, when you really need to use this thing, no matter how precious the item is, it's not as valuable as your own life. He carefully wrapped the bomb in strips of cloth to prevent accidental detonation. Ultimately, Hextech crystals are far more unstable than Chitauri crystals. Even ordinary bumps and knocks can cause them to explode. In addition to the crafting rules, Luca also noticed that this time the 1-5, after Battle of the Two Cities world, on the panel has changed to 2-5. Perhaps something different will happen once I gather all 5 core components from the same world. Putting these matters aside for the time being, Luca looked at the mess of supplies, hesitated for a moment, but still decided to throw out both headless Chitauri corpses. The house is in such a dilapidated state, and it has been invaded by aliens. After this war ends, there will definitely be officials coming to clean it up. If it were just two Chitauri folding light guns and a purple crystal that were hidden, perhaps no one would have noticed. But with two such large corpses lying here, they would definitely be taken away by the authorities. It would be better to just throw them away now to avoid trouble later. Luca first walked to the hole in the building and peered downstairs. After confirming that no one was below, they simply dragged a Chitauri corpse down and threw it down. However, as Luca threw the second body down, a scream immediately came from below. Even with the sounds of gunfire and explosions outside, the scream was not drowned out. Oh no, did it hit someone? Luca immediately leaned half his body out again to look down, but the sight before him caused his expression to change several times. The reason was that at that moment, 4 people he knew all too well appeared in the alley below the building. A tall man with green skin was crouching down, concernedly checking on his companion who had been hit by the falling corpse. With a casual toss, the green giant flung the corpse that Luca had struggled to throw down the building more than 10 meters away. The unfortunate man who was hit by the corpse was wearing a dark red leather jacket. He was twitching at the corner of his mouth, cursing and trying to get up. The other 2, one of whom was wearing a blue bodysuit and holding a metal round shield. Although the last person was only wearing an ordinary jacket, Luca had just seen a younger version of his face. That's right, the 4 people who suddenly appeared below were none other than Bruce Banner, Hulk, Scott Lang, Ant-Man, Steve Rogers, Captain America, and Tony Stark, Iron Man. More importantly, Luca also knew that all 4 of them came from the future. Damn it, isn't this a scene from Avengers: Endgame? Before they could think, the 4 of them looked up at the same time. Luca's expression changed rapidly, and he immediately put on a somewhat panicked look. Sorry, my house has been invaded by aliens. I just checked, and there's no one downstairs. Oh my God. Are you Iron Man, Captain America, and the Hulk? I've seen you on TV before. Seeing Luca's somewhat incoherent speech, the 4 people below breathed a slight sigh of relief. Tony Stark, who reacted the fastest, spoke first, pointing at Luca. Hey kid, this isn't your fault. Go back and hide and protect yourself. Upon hearing Tony's words, Steve Rogers immediately realized that their sudden appearance and Scott's being hit were simply bad luck. Recalling what he looked like 10 years ago, Steve straightened his posture slightly and said loudly, "Child, go back quickly. We're dealing with aliens and we'll be done with it soon." Luca, who didn't want to have much contact with these people in the first place, didn't intend to say anything more after hearing what the 2 were saying. However, before he could retreat back into the house, Ho tilde. Amidst angry roars. On the main road next to them, a Hulk several times larger than Bruce Banner in front of them leaped over with a bang while holding a wrecked car high in the air. They started smashing a bunch of things at an unlucky Chitauri. Only after the car, along with the Chitauri people it had crushed, was nearly smashed into a pancake, did the enraged Hulk roar again and leap away to who knows where. The scene immediately became awkward. Everyone, including Luca, looked at Dr. Banner, who was covering his face and didn't know what to say. Was that the Hulk's brother? Seeing that the 4 people below were all standing there awkwardly, and instead of getting to their business, Luca could only pretend to be stupid and break the silence for them. Yes, that's right. He's the Hulk's brother, the Hulk, yes. Scott pointed at Bruce Banner beside him, gesturing wildly. Finally, he thought for a moment, and for some reason, added another sentence. Oh, and you can call me Ant-Man, though I haven't been on TV yet. The others all stared speechlessly at Scott, who had just said that. Seeing that the problem was solved, Luca naturally prepared to tactfully withdraw. He left behind the words, "Wishing you all the best," and immediately retreated back inside. The group downstairs exchanged glances and quickly left the spot, but Tony Stark still whispered a warning to Scott beside him. You shouldn't reveal your identity. It could affect the future of their timeline. Especially since the person you told was that kid Luca Orange. Wow, first of all, thank you to all the readers who have been following along. I never expected that my book, which has only had 4 chapters published, would receive so much support from readers. Also, thanks to the shameless husky. Hee, that startled me. I didn't expect anyone to vote for me with 8 monthly tickets right away. Thank you, thank you. End of this chapter. Chapter 7, A Reckless Decision. Chapter 7, A Reckless Decision. Luca, who was upstairs, naturally didn't hear the conversation of the departing group, but at the moment, his mind wasn't on them either. Even though those people seemed to radiate a white light that belonged to the core components in Luca's eyes. Captain America's shield, Iron Man's nanotech armor core and glasses, Ant-Man's suit, and even the Hulk's shorts, etc. All of this was suggesting to Luca that items belonging to characters connected to the plot were more likely to become core components. But at this moment, he was in no mood to care about any of that, and his face was extremely pale. It's because he himself never expected that this place would actually be the unfortunate timeline that Tony Stark and his team traveled to in the Avengers. Endgame storyline. Why is this called the unlucky timeline? We should go back to Luca, who had just finished watching the American TV series Loki before he time traveled. The series, a spin-off of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, begins because Iron Man and his friends in Avengers. Endgame wanted to borrow the Infinity Stones from that point in time to save their world. An unexpected event occurred midway, and the Tesseract, also known as the Space Stone, ended up in Loki's hands at this point in time. Loki escaped with the Tesseract, causing a historical deviation, and was captured by an organization called TVA, Time Mutation Administration. The purpose of this organization, TVA, is to protect the so-called sacred timeline and ensure that everything unfolds according to a predetermined trajectory. However, Loki's departure and the subsequent events in the TVA were not important to Luca. Importantly, there was a scene in the series that left a very deep impression on Luca. That is, at the beginning, after Loki was captured by the TVA, those people directly placed a time-clipping bomb in this timeline, which completely destroyed this biased timeline. Yes, the entire timeline was wiped out. When Luca first watched the show, he even complained about it to his friends. When Bruce Banner borrowed the Time Stone from the Ancient One, he confidently assured her that they would return it and that it wouldn't affect the course of the world. However, Loki took the Space Stone, and Iron Man and Captain America went to 1970 to obtain a new Tesseract. Ironically, this entire timeline was destroyed. I wonder who Captain America returned the other 2 Infinity Stones to when he came back in the end. Although Marvel's parallel universes, timelines, and time branches are inherently confusing and chaotic, Luca and his friends spent a long time discussing it but still couldn't come to a conclusion. But would Luca dare to take such a gamble? He bet that the timeline of Avengers, Endgame, was created by the Avengers, but Loki didn't take the Tesseract. Or is it that you're betting that your existence is a special parallel universe, unaffected by TVA, thus preventing the entire timeline from being cut off? Luca's expression grew increasingly grim as he thought about it. If we're talking about affecting the timeline, then wouldn't my existence count as affecting the timeline? I haven't been captured yet. Does that mean the Time Mutation Management Bureau doesn't exist in this world? No, I have to go check. No, I have to stop Loki. Luca clearly remembered that after Loki picked up the Tesseract, he was teleported directly to Mongolia, where he was captured by the TVA agents, who then dropped a time-cutting bomb before leaving. If that's the case, then I won't even be able to stop it or confirm it when the time comes, and I can only wait for the final verdict in fear. Instead of gambling on that possibility, it would be better to stop Loki at the source. With this in mind, Luca immediately gave up waiting at home for the Battle of New York to end and quickly checked his equipment. After thinking for a moment, he moved his mother, Gina, to the storage room and settled her in. He then left a note and immediately went out, heading towards Stark Tower. In fact, the streets outside didn't seem nearly as dangerous as Luca had imagined. By this time, large numbers of National Guard troops had taken to the streets, with armed pickup trucks and heavily armed soldiers drawing away much of the Chitauri fire. Although the fighting remained difficult, it created space for New York police officers and firefighters to evacuate civilians. If it weren't for the Chitauri continuously pouring out of that hole in the sky, New York might actually have been able to hold out with its current military strength. Of course, this may also be because the heavily armed Chitauri airships and Leviathan warships focused their main targets on the Avengers members. In short, Luca, an ordinary civilian, was so inconspicuous on the street that he was almost taken away by the police who were evacuating the crowd and taken to the subway station next door several times. However, such good fortune obviously cannot last forever. As Luca got closer to Stark Tower, the Chitauri soldiers around him became increasingly dense. If it weren't for the fear in his heart that he might mysteriously disappear along with the entire timeline, Luca might have already given up. Whoosh tilde. A rectangular grenade, shaped like a walkie-talkie, streaked across the sky and landed with a clatter in front of an armored off-road vehicle. Immediately afterwards, there was a loud boom. An eerie blue flash of light erupted, and the armored vehicle, along with more than a dozen soldiers around it, was blown away on the spot. Luca, hiding behind an overturned bus, didn't even bother to glance at it. What I was thinking about was, that Chitauri grenade seemed to have a synthetic white glow on it. It just exploded and disappeared. I don't know if I was seeing things. Just as Luca was preparing to hide behind the bus for a while longer, waiting for the Chitauri to leave before sneaking forward. Suddenly, a violent explosion came from above. Large chunks of rock crashed down from the sky, dragging several Zeta Swiss soldiers who had been desperately climbing toward the roof with them. Fortunately, Luca's strength enhancement shoes were always on the lowest setting. Upon hearing the explosion overhead, he quickly pushed off with his feet and darted towards a nearby shop. There was a crash sound. The glass was shattered. The prosthetic right arm scraped and bumped against the ground. Luca rolled twice before finally managing to steady himself against a shelf. Immediately afterwards, there were several loud thuds as heavy objects crashed to the ground. The Chitauri who had fallen from the sky earlier all crashed to the ground, and it was clear that none of them were going to survive. Luca glanced at it and breathed a slight sigh of relief. Luckily, I dodged it quickly tilde. However, at that moment, a low growl that sounded somewhat fierce, but actually cowardly came from behind him. Kid, get out of here. End of this chapter. Chapter 8 Didn't and -039 TUC I had a gun. Chapter 8 Didn't you see I had a gun? Luca turned around quickly upon hearing the sound. Behind the convenience store counter, two burly, bald black men with fierce expressions peeked out from behind the counter. One of them was holding a pistol of unknown model, pointing it directly at his chest. Damn it, what are you looking at? I told you to get out. Don't attract those monsters. Another bald black man holding a dagger leaned out again, forcibly lowering his voice to shout at Luca, while also gesturing with the dagger in his hand. However, judging from his timid demeanor, where he didn't even dare to speak loudly, he really didn't have much of a deterrent effect. It was only at this point that Luca noticed. Right next to the counter, a young woman in a convenience store uniform lay in a pool of blood, stabbed multiple times. After a little thought, Luca could guess the general idea. It's nothing more than two pieces of trash who are too afraid to go out and escape, so they've taken over the place and are just waiting to die. However, after noticing Luca's gaze, the black man with the gun seemed to gain more confidence, and his voice became louder. Get out of here. If you don't leave, this is yours. However, before he could finish speaking, Luca suddenly raised his gun. A pale blue laser beam shot out and struck the gunman squarely in the chest. The guy, who had just started to stand up, was instantly sent flying backward with a charred chest, knocking over a large amount of the clutter behind the counter. Before the other burly black man could even react to what was happening, a second laser beam followed. Boom tilde. The same scene repeated itself, with the burly black man wielding a short knife also flying backward. Idiot, can't you see I have a gun too? Seeing the two lying on the ground, Luca didn't care whether they were still alive or not. He went forward and shot them both in the head to make sure the two idiots were completely dead. Only then did he stretch his back, which was a little sore from crashing into the store, and turn around to continue his journey. But when he got to the store entrance, he discovered. I don't know if it was because of the explosion upstairs earlier, or the commotion caused by killing those two black guys. At that moment, several Zeta Swiss soldiers carrying light guns slowly surrounded the location of the shop. Moreover, just as Luca discovered these Chitauri, these aliens also noticed him. No time to think too much. Without saying a word, Luca hooked a can of soda on the ground with his right foot and volleyed it into the air. At the same time, he quickly aimed the folding light gun in his hand and pulled the trigger repeatedly. A rapidly spinning aluminum can and several laser beams are emitted simultaneously. The can, unsurprisingly, hit the bullseye, exploding directly on a Chitauri's head and knocking him unconscious on the spot. However, due to the hasty firing, only one of the several laser beams hit its target. The remaining Zetalian soldiers, naturally, would not let Luca, their enemy, go unpunished, and immediately raised their guns to aim. However, before Luca could jump away again and hide behind cover, he was caught off guard. A familiar golden red figure spun and plummeted rapidly from the sky. As if bowling, it knocked over 4 or 5 Zeta Swiss soldiers with a series of clanging and banging sounds before crashing heavily to the ground. The first unlucky guy who was hit even exploded on the spot, his head rolling down in front of Luca. This is the third time. Was Tony really this disheveled in the movie? Looking at Tony Stark landing in front of him in almost the same way once again, Luca felt a little amused and exasperated. Captain Tsubasa. Similarly, Stark, who was struggling to get up, also noticed Luca in the store. Before he could even figure out why this kid wasn't staying home obediently, but instead running around, more Zeta Swiss soldiers were already rapidly closing in on him. Clearly, in the eyes of these Chitauri, eliminating these members of the Avengers was a very high priority. Several laser beams struck Tony Stark's armor in succession, making it impossible for him to maintain his footing. They could only manage a difficult fight using their weak palm cannons. Wait a minute, isn't this the scene before Iron Man went to fight the nuclear bomb? This somewhat familiar scene immediately made Luca realize that he had to help the other side quickly eliminate these enemies. Otherwise, if Stark goes off with all his might to deal with the nuclear bomb, I might not be able to handle the encirclement of so many Chitauri by myself. The thought flashed through his mind, and Luca quickly raised his gun and aimed. Several bursts of fire instantly took down 2 Chitauri who were besieging Tony Stark. However, his actions clearly angered his enemies, who had previously ignored him. Immediately, several Chitauri raised their guns and fired in the direction of Luca. Fortunately, Luca had anticipated this and quickly moved away from the spot. Meanwhile, in the middle of the street, Tony, having gotten a brief respite, immediately raised his hand and killed 3 Chitauri. However, just as Luca rolled off the ground to get up and prepared to continue his counterattack, but he discovered that there were already 2 light guns aimed at him from the other side. Not good. Kid, get out of the way. Stark lunged forward, knocking down a Chitauri soldier, while simultaneously firing a beam of light from his right palm, blasting another Chitauri soldier away. However, the second attack was ultimately a step too late. The Chitauri who had been blasted away had already pulled the trigger. A pale blue laser beam shot towards Luca's location in an instant. OS***T. Even the moment Luca noticed he was being targeted, he had already made a dodge maneuver. However, in this crouching position after the roll, the strength bonus from the strength-enhancing shoes cannot be fully utilized, and the dodging action is far less swift than before. At this point, all one can do is try to raise their arms to protect themselves while trying to dodge. Bang tilde. A loud explosion. A burst of sparks erupted from Luca's arm, and he was sent flying backward, crashing heavily into a car behind him. The force of the impact caused Luca to feel a sharp pain in his back, followed by a blackout, and he almost fainted on the spot. The sound of the explosion, along with the muffled thud of the impact, left Luca with a ringing in his ears. A strong, metallic taste instantly filled my mouth, and bright red blood flowed from the corner of my mouth. It slowly slid down from the somewhat dented car door. Fortunately, his right leg, which was constantly receiving the lowest level of electric shock, still had strength, which allowed Luca to stay upright and not fall to the ground. This body seems to be lacking in exercise. Luca opened his somewhat blurry eyes. He raised his hand to look at his broken prosthetic right arm, then suddenly grinned, revealing a somewhat eerie smile through his blood-soaked mouth. Haha, thank goodness I'm right-handed. End of this chapter. Chapter 9, Stark Tower. Chapter 9, Stark Tower. He coughed up another small mouthful of blood, but Luca's smile remained unchanged. Just now, if he hadn't been still adjusting to his severed right arm and hadn't instinctively used his prosthetic to defend himself, he might have already said goodbye to his left arm by now. With such a joyous occasion, how could Luca not be happy, ignoring the excruciating pain and helplessness coursing through my entire body? Looking towards Tony Stark in the distance, only 2 Chitauri soldiers remained. Because of the previous explosion, Luca had lost his folding light gun somewhere. With a little force, he tore off his prosthetic right hand, which was less than a third of its original size, and casually tossed it in front of him. Immediately afterwards, he exerted force with his right foot, and the electric arcs on his red and white sneakers flashed again. Next moment, boom! The broken prosthetic limb at Luca's feet flew like a cannonball, covering a distance of more than 10 meters in an instant, and struck a Zeta Swiss soldier on the head with sparks and lightning. The electric arc exploded, scattering parts everywhere. It's unclear whether it was due to the power of the rules or simply the perfect force of the attack. The Chitauri man who was hit by the shell tilted his head to the side, and without uttering a sound, he simply passed out. Take down the last Chitauri, Tony Stark. Seeing Luca's right forearm empty, his mouth full of blood but his body standing straight with a smile, Luca was stunned for a moment. This child... Even the experienced Stark was at a loss for words when it came to evaluating the young man before him. But at least he knew one thing. Everything the boy in front of him was doing was to help him. However, before he could say anything more, the call started again through the headset on the armor helmet. Stark, can you hear me? A missile is heading straight for Manhattan. Upon hearing Nick Fury's announcement, Tony Stark's expression immediately hardened beneath his visor. After glancing at Luca, who was sitting against the wrecked car, he quickly replied, "How long until the missile arrives?" In a maximum of 3 minutes, the nuclear bomb it carries could level the entire city center. Upon hearing this, Tony Stark dared not delay any longer. He yelled at Luca in the distance, "Child, find somewhere to hide, don't run around." After saying this, flames immediately shot out from his limbs, and he flew rapidly into the air. Watching Iron Man fly away, Luca twitched the corners of his mouth, revealing an ugly smile, and didn't take the other person's words to heart. He simply propped himself up with one hand and stood up again, his eyes fixed on the Stark Tower in the distance, a hint of excitement in his eyes that he hadn't shown before. Has the nuclear missile arrived? I'd better hurry. Perhaps even Luca himself didn't realize that. At some point, the thrill of achieving his goal had far outweighed his fear of death. He picked up the backpack that had fallen to the side, and then pulled out a nearly new folding light gun from a Chitauri corpse. Luca curled his lip in disdain. I don't even have any spatial equipment. I'm really embarrassing myself as a transmigrator. Time flies by in the blink of an eye. For the next 2 minutes or so, Luca did not engage in combat with any more Zetalian soldiers. Although he sensed he was getting a little too excited, he could still distinguish between enjoying the thrill and actively courting death. He tried his best to avoid enemies, occasionally launching a sneak attack. Luca witnessed Iron Man carrying a missile and soaring into the sky, and also saw the giant hole in the sky close. Countless Zeta Swiss soldiers fell in droves, like robots that had lost power. The massive Leviathan warship crashed to the ground, and the Chitauri airships, which had been speeding along, went out of control and crashed into buildings and streets. The few people who remained on the street went from being stunned to cheering, and then to crying and laughing wildly. It seemed everyone was celebrating this hard-won victory. Only Luca had already quickly arrived at the Stark Tower. So that's how these guys got upstairs. Watching the Hulk, carrying Iron Man and Captain America in each hand, jump to the top of Stark Tower. while Thor, wielding Thor's hammer and carrying Hawkeye, followed closely behind. How did these people manage to get in front of Loki and pose for him before he even woke up? The question that had been troubling Luca for so long has finally been answered. Is this really necessary? After shaking his head speechlessly, Luca, who had been keeping an eye on the movements in the air, immediately noticed that another golden-red figure had silently flown into the top floor of the building. Here we go. I only glanced at it before looking away. Luca's attention was focused more on the first floor of the Stark Tower in front of him. The Zeta Swiss soldiers had only recently been dealt with, and the lobby on the first floor was still in complete chaos. Police and rescue workers have not yet arrived. The majority of people at the scene are Stark Tower employees and nearby civilians. Some people tried to run out to ask for help, while others tried to run inside to seek refuge. The few security guards still on duty simply couldn't manage so many people. If Luca wanted to sneak in at this point, it would be incredibly easy. However, he also knew that the Shield agents would arrive soon, and Luca did not want to be exposed to them for the time being. Moreover, it's not necessarily necessary to enter the building to stop Loki from taking the Tesseract. After searching around and finding a spot where he could see the entire first floor of the building through the glass exterior walls, Luca began to wait patiently. Before long, a large number of special agents arrived at the scene and began to maintain order. However, people were in a state of panic at the moment, especially since the Chitauri, who had previously been their enemies, were so distinctive. Therefore, these agents and the New York police who followed were only trying their best to maintain order and evacuate the wounded, and did not disperse ordinary civilians. At the same time, Luca also noticed that above the building, Tony Stark from the future leaped down and landed in a secluded corner. Not long after, a fully armed Shield agent in a Special Forces uniform emerged from the corner where Tony Stark had disappeared. However, the white light, emanating from the other party's entire body, was simply too conspicuous. Nano armor, how convenient. Watching Tony, disguised, walk into the building, and watching Loki, escorted by the Avengers, take the elevator down and appear in the lobby. Luca also turned the knob on his strength-enhancing shoes again. After thinking for a moment, he took out the monkey bomb from his backpack, which was missing a Hextech crystal. However, Luca had just finished making the move when he suddenly realized something. The previously noisy environment suddenly fell silent. The sirens and shouts of the crowd, which had been quite loud, seemed to have been abruptly cut off. End of this chapter, Chapter 10 Loki, Chapter 10 Loki. Luca instinctively looked up. Only then did I realize that the whole world seemed to have been paused. The panicked expressions on people's faces were frozen in time. The previously flickering flames seemed to have turned into a clumsy flat special effect, and the water sprayed by the fire truck floated quietly in the air, with the sparkling water droplets clearly visible. In this completely still world, there was only one person, with a smile on his face, slowly walking towards Luca's direction. The sound of the approaching person's thump-thump footsteps seemed so abrupt in this world where time seemed to stand still. Luca swallowed hard, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple. I tried to open my mouth to say something, but found that I couldn't make a sound. Tilda, I think you didn't really need to use that toy, did you? The newcomer pointed to the little monkey bomb in Luca's hand, speaking in a very gentle tone, with a hint of cynicism in his voice. However, although the other party's behavior seemed to express goodwill, Luca dared not relax at all. Gently putting down the little monkey bomb in his hand, he rubbed his temples, feeling a bit of a headache. He uttered a name. Loki, the god of stories. Yes, although the Loki in front of us was only wearing the green Asgardian suit from Avengers 1, and his hair was a bit messy and his clothes were covered in dust, he looked rather disheveled. However, judging from the fact that this situation has directly frozen the entire world's time, Loki has undoubtedly taken the final step and become the god of stories, Loki, or rather, God Loki, who controls the entire timeline of the Maku. It's laughable that Luca risked so much to get to Stark Tower just to stop Loki from taking the Tesseract and entering the Time Mutation Bureau, to ensure that their own timeline would not be affected and destroyed. What appeared before him was the final form of Loki after completing 2 seasons of the entire series. Loki seemed oblivious to Luca's complex emotions, or perhaps he was aware but didn't care. He still smiled and spread his hands, looking somewhat interested. God of Stories, not a bad title tilde so, that's what people from your world call me. Upon hearing this, Luca, who had just calmed down a little, had his pupils widen in shock once again. The simple phrase your world directly exposed Luca's outsider status. However, Luca thought again and realized that if it was Loki, then he would be considered to be almost the ceiling of the Marvel universe. Knowing one's origins is not something that seems surprising. Surprised, actually, someone like you isn't exactly an isolated case. Let me think. In a certain world before, there was a girl named Gwynpel who, like you, also came from the real world. This time, Luca didn't even have the strength to be shocked. Goodness, not only does he know he comes from another world, but he even uses the term real world. However, he had never heard of Gwynpel Luca, whom Loki mentioned. She's called Gwen, but that doesn't sound like she's from the same place as me, does it? Luca, whose mind was already somewhat numb, hesitated for a moment, then stopped dwelling on the other party's omniscience, and instead asked directly. So, you know that the world you live in is Luca didn't know what to say. Are you suggesting I just say you're a movie character? Actually, your real name should be Tom Hiddleston, and your nickname is Loki. What if the other party understands it differently than I do? I might say too much and anger this almost omniscient and omnipotent being. However, Loki himself seemed completely unconcerned, and instead spoke calmly. You mean TV series? Yes, tilde, I know tilde. Loki pursed his lips, raised an eyebrow, and said in a natural tone, Don't worry too much about these things. The world doesn't work as simply as you think. Perhaps you can think of the real world I'm talking about as, well, a universe where superpowers are depicted in film and television. Since there are zombie universes, Spider-Man universes, and flat two-dimensional universes, then it shouldn't be too hard to understand if there were a world without any supernatural abilities, where people just treat these things as entertainment in movies and TV shows, right? Or rather, how can you be sure that what you perceive as the real world isn't what people in other worlds see as a movie or a novel? Seeing Loki's casual tone, Luca had no way to refute him. This kind of thing has risen to the philosophical level, which Luca himself doesn't quite understand, let alone discuss with the god in front of him who has countless parallel universe timelines. However, he also noticed the key point in Loki's words and immediately pressed for an answer. Since you understand the real world, can you? At this point, Luca suddenly stopped talking. He wanted to ask Loki if he could send him back to his original universe. But halfway through his sentence, Luca suddenly realized that he seemed to have no attachments left in his original world. Rather than returning to that world of the past, having a wonderful adventure here seems like a worthwhile option, even if it means experiencing various crises or even dying on the road to adventure. However, Loki seemed to understand Luca's implied meaning and simply said, It can't be done. In fact, even now, I am far from being omniscient and omnipotent. My abilities still have limitations. What you expect is, at least for me right now, impossible. Upon hearing this, Luca simply nodded calmly. For a moment, I couldn't tell whether I felt disappointed or relieved. However, another question arose in Luca's mind. If you're not planning to drive me out of this world, then what is your purpose in appearing here? When he asked the question again, Loki did not answer immediately this time. Instead, he turned to look at the lobby of Stark Tower. There in the still world, another Loki, handcuffed, stood like a statue. For some reason, Luca saw a barely perceptible hint of envy in the eyes of the god Loki before him. Someone asked me to give you a choice. Also, I need to give you a, identity verification, something like that tilde. Loki quickly turned back to look at Luca, the strange expression in his eyes vanishing as if it had never existed, replaced by the same playful smile he had shown before. But what he said made Luca freeze in place. Huh? Someone actually asked you for a favor? And what kind of opportunity? What kind of status? What are you talking about, boss? End of this chapter. Chapter 11, thank you for coming into this world. Chapter 11, thank you for coming into this world. Luca was completely stunned and stood there, while Loki across from him still smiled. Let me verify your identity first. As he spoke, Loki gently pointed his finger, and a stream of emerald green light shot directly towards Luca, continuously wrapping around him until the green light completely enveloped Luca's body before dissipating. All of this happened in an instant, and even Luca himself didn't have time to react. But when Luca came to his senses, he vaguely felt that the sense of disconnect between himself and the world that had been lingering for the past 2 months was rapidly disappearing. Luca was quite certain that his feeling was not an illusion, but when he looked at Loki again, the other party simply waved his hand casually. Yeah, sitting in that seat all by yourself with no one to talk to can get a bit boring. Since someone has asked me for this, I certainly don't mind giving you a chance to choose again. After all, the reason you're here right now is precisely because you knew of my existence and made a misjudgment. Luca fell silent again upon hearing this. Yes, the reason I took such a huge risk to be here was not only because of my adventurous spirit, but also because I was afraid that the timeline would be destroyed and I would disappear along with it. If Luca had known earlier that Loki had ascended to the throne, and that the so-called divine timeline no longer existed, he might have obediently stayed at home and waited for the Battle of New York to end. Now that Loki has appeared before him, and he is certain that the world will not be destroyed as a result, it seems that he really doesn't need to risk stopping Loki anymore. However, Luca then turned his attention to something else. So, can you tell me who asked you to come? Clearly, compared to what Loki is doing right now, the guy who can get his attention is equally noteworthy. After all, this person just said that someone like him is not uncommon. So what merit do he have to attract the attention of that big shot who can persuade Loki to act? However, when Luca asked him a question, Loki gave a strange smile and then gave a somewhat exaggerated bow with one hand on his chest. I've said everything I needed to say. The choice is now yours to make. Crisis and opportunity coexist. Thank you for coming into this world, Tilda. As he finished speaking, Loki's figure transformed into countless pale green specks of light, disappearing like a dream bubble. The once static world gradually came alive with his disappearance. As time seemed to resume its flow, Luca, standing in the same spot, still had a furrowed brow. Damn, I hate these kinds of riddle-solving people the most. However, after saying this, Luca was taken aback. The world, which had seemed to have returned to stillness, suddenly stopped again in a bizarre way. Even the movements of the pedestrians on the street did not change at all. Seeing this, Luca's face fell, and he quickly muttered something under his breath. No, it's not annoying at all. It was my fault for being so sharp-tongued. You should go back now. However, the still world before them did not end. Instead, a crackling sound of sparks bouncing came from behind Luca. Immediately afterwards, a woman's voice reached Luca's ears. Has His Majesty already left? Luca felt a chill run down his spine and immediately turned around to prepare for a fight. However, upon seeing who it was, he blurted out the answer instinctively. Gabriel. The moment he said that, even the person behind him was taken aback. However, upon noticing the simple yellow monk's robe and the golden portal halo behind him, Luca immediately realized he had misspoke and coughed awkwardly. Master Ancient One. Yes, the person who arrived was none other than the Sorcerer Supreme, the Guardian of Earth, the most powerful sorcerer, the Ancient One. Just no way this Ancient One has hair. Although Luca tried his best to control his gaze, he still subconsciously glanced at the newcomer's short, light blonde hair. The Ancient One clearly noticed Luca's gaze as well. Have you seen me from other worlds? As she spoke, she gently twirled her curly hair and responded with a smile. You always have to differentiate yourself from your counterparts in other worlds, don't you? Looking at the Ancient One, who not only had a different hairstyle, but also seemed much younger than he remembered, Luca couldn't help but think to himself. If you had appeared sooner, how could I have mistaken this world? Luca then looked toward the portal behind the Ancient One. Time seemed to stand still there, and you could even see Bruce Banner, the Hulk, who had been standing downstairs from your apartment, now lying quietly on the rooftop behind the portal. Seeing that Luca's gaze was starting to wander again, the Ancient One with hair in front of him decided to bring the topic back and continue asking questions. Has His Majesty already left? Luca quickly looked away, but since he was unsure of the Ancient One's temperament in this world, he chose to restrain himself and honestly answer her questions. Lord Loki should have already left. Is there something you need him for? To everyone's surprise, Guya shook her head slightly. I have no way of contacting His Majesty. I'm here to find you. Luca frowned slightly upon hearing this. Unable to reach. Is it that it's unreachable, or that it's impossible to have contact? Thinking back to what Loki had said to him earlier, there was indeed something strange about this. However, now the Ancient One claims to have come to find him. He'd already experienced enough excitement that day, and now another big shot was coming to him. Am I really some kind of hot commodity? Slightly annoyed, Luca didn't bother with any guessing games and simply asked directly. What does Master Guya want with me? It can't be that Loki, the god, is too lazy to banish him, so the Ancient One, the guardian of Earth, ends up banishing him instead, can it? Looking at the young man in front of him, who was frowning and slightly hesitant, Guya smiled slightly and gave his answer directly. I'm here to make a deal with you. Upon hearing this, Luca immediately shuddered. That sounds familiar. However, he did not rush to speak, but quietly waited for Guya to continue. With a slight beckoning of his finger, the Ancient One released a Hextech crystal that was completely encased in Luca's package. Luca looked closely and saw that it was the core component that could synthesize the Hextech core. However, since the big boss needs it, Luca, a mere Karami, wouldn't be ungrateful and would naturally offer it up with both hands. Master Ancient One, you're joking. Since you want it, let's not talk about a deal. I'll just give it to you. However, the Ancient One shook her head again, gently pinched the Hextech crystal, and put it back into Luca's hand. No need to send it as a gift. What I need isn't the crystal itself, but the finished product after you've completed it. Then I'll give you a reward that will satisfy you. Yes, a very satisfying reward, Tilda. Looking at the heavy Hextech crystal in his hand, Luca was speechless. Well, why are you acting like everyone knows about my limited abilities? That. Luca looked up again, about to speak, when the Ancient One vanished without a trace. Time resumed its flow, and the cacophony of sounds rushed into our ears once more. End of this chapter. Chapter 12, The Battle of New York ends. Chapter 12, The Battle of New York ends. What Luca actually wanted to say was, since the Ancient One has a need for the Hextech core, could she simply give me 4 different magical runes, and if convenient, also borrow a small arc reactor from Tony Stark's vault? In that case, I might be able to synthesize a hex core on the spot and trade it with the other party. This also saves even a great being like the Ancient One from having to wait. To everyone's surprise, the other party simply disappeared without even saying goodbye. These big shots, they're all F***G riddle solvers. While thinking this to himself, Luca did have some guesses about why the Ancient One wanted the Hextech core. According to the established lore, most sorcerers in the Marvel Universe do not actually possess magical powers. To cast a spell, one needs to borrow power from the corresponding dimensional demon. Since it's alone, it naturally needs to be repaid. For those who are the source of white magic, like the Vishanti, it's all right. No matter how much they use it in the end, it's just working to pay off their debts. If it were the power of a dark demon like Dormammu, even borrowing a little of that power might cause the caster to fall into corruption and become a mindless puppet. The Hex Core is essentially an endless source of magical energy. Luca had no idea where the power was drawn from. But if they had this, perhaps the mages of Camertage would be able to draw power from it to cast spells, without having to borrow power from dimensional demons. This kind of thing might not be very useful to a big shot like the Ancient One, who is a long-time deadbeat who borrows money and then beats up his creditors. However, for the ordinary mages in Camertage, It probably means they won't have to be so careful when using spells, making them all melee musclemen. With these random thoughts swirling in his mind, Luca took one last look in the direction of Stark Tower. Unexpectedly, Loki picked up the tesseract from the ground. It can be noticed without close inspection. The tesseract that Loki held in his hand was radiating a bright white light that none of the previous core components had ever seen. The white radiance even faintly overshadowed the glow of the cosmic cube itself. Although the distance was far, Luca instinctively took 2 steps closer. However, before he could make a move, Loki had already taken advantage of everyone's inattention and quickly opened a portal, disappearing from the spot. The core component, the space stone or the tesseract, that level of white light could probably be used to synthesize something extraordinary. What a pity. Recalling the feeling from just now, Luca shook his head helplessly and picked up his backpack from the ground again. It's something I can't get my hands on right now. This kind of hot potato is best left untouched until I have a chance to get my hands on it later and see what I can synthesize. With his current strength, even if he obtained such a treasure, he would be powerless to keep it. With this in mind, Luca followed the crowd that had scattered in fright at Hulk and hurried back towards his home. Along the way, Luca was also making plans in his mind. Although I've decided not to interfere, Loki's departure means the future has changed from what I remember. And it's confirmed this isn't a cinematic timeline, so it seems I shouldn't rely too much on the plot going forward. At least as far as Luca is concerned, the Rainbow Bridge in Asgard is still in a state of damage. Thor was originally supposed to take the Tesseract to repair the Bifrost. Without this, it will be much more difficult for Thor to travel to and from Earth. In the original movie Avengers Endgame, Captain America did return several Infinity Stones in the end. However, he initially took Loki's scepter with the Mind Stone, but returned only the Mind Stone, which will inevitably affect the plot. However, Luca's current strength and influence are too insignificant, and even if he considers some things, he is powerless to participate. Thinking about how these things might affect subsequent events, Luca soon returned to his apartment building. Apart from being nearly taken to a medical center by disaster relief workers a few times, he didn't encounter any major trouble. He glanced into the alley and, not seeing the returning Avengers, Endgame crew prepared to go upstairs. However, at that moment, Luca noticed several medical rescue workers carrying a stretcher quickly out of the building. And the robust, middle-aged woman following beside the stretcher turned out to be an acquaintance of Luca. Aunt Samira. Luca took 2 quick steps forward, and the woman he called Aunt Samira turned around at the sound of his voice, then rushed over and pulled Luca into her arms. "Young Master Luca, I thought you were also." The woman in front of me is named Samira Beretskaya, and she is the Orange family's driver and bodyguard. She was very close to Luca's mother, Gina Orange, who was said to have been a real, tough female soldier who had actually been on the battlefield, but for some reason chose to retire and become a driver. In short, in Luca's memory, when the original owner was very young, Aunt Samira had been by her mother's side. She had no relatives or social connections and should be considered the most trustworthy person in her parents' lives. Luca looked over Samira's shoulder. Sure enough, lying on the stretcher was his mother, Gina. Has she still not woken up? But since she was rescued, she's still lucky. A pang of guilt flashed through his mind for leaving Gina, who was seriously injured and unconscious, alone at home, but he quickly dismissed it. Instead, Samira, who was holding Luca, looked at the boy's gaze as he stared at the stretcher with heartache. "Sir, he's all right. Young Master Luca, are you all right?" She gently supported Luca's right arm, which was missing its prosthesis. She had originally wanted to ask Luca where he had run off to, but she just pursed her lips and didn't say anything more. Luca shook his head slightly upon seeing this. "I just lost her on the street. How is my mother now?" Luca knew that Samira had probably just arrived from the company, but at least she had seen the paramedics lift Gina onto the stretcher, so she should have some understanding of her condition. Having been a veteran of the battlefield, Samira quickly suppressed her emotions upon hearing this and explained to Luca. "There are only a few external injuries, which have been bandaged. The cause of the coma is still undetermined and will require further examination at the hospital. Fortunately, the Homeowners Association is quite capable, and the rescue team here was among the most timely. As for whether a private medical team will be needed later, we will need to wait for the initial examination results to make a judgment. Luca nodded upon hearing this. Although the attack on Manhattan was in the city center, and the area affected was quite large, the number of damaged buildings and the dead and injured was not small. But the luxury apartment building, where the Orange family lived, was already quite expensive, and most of the residents were people of a certain social standing. Therefore, both immediate rescue and treatment, as well as post-disaster reconstruction, will be given top priority. Moreover, although the Orange family is currently facing numerous internal problems, their assets and social standing remain intact. Even if all hospitals in New York are overcrowded, Gina, the mother, will still have the private ward she deserves. Of course, most ordinary casualties will likely not be sent to hospitals, but will receive treatment at temporary safe medical points. After all, the actual number of casualties this time was simply too high. Father, the gentleman's body has been removed, and the Disaster Control Department will contact a private medical team to receive it. The company, the Xiacheng district, was basically unaffected this time. As they exchanged questions and answers, the two got into the ambulance and headed to the hospital. End of this chapter, Chapter 13, After the Disaster, Funeral. Chapter 13, After the Disaster, Funeral. 7 days after the Battle of New York, at Cypress Hill Cemetery. Compared to Samira's sorrowful expression, Luca's face appeared much calmer. Because her father, Herman, was half Chinese, Luca ultimately chose this burial site for him, the Beishan Cemetery, which is said to have excellent feng shui and has buried many famous Chinese figures. Surrounded by guests coming and going to pay their respects, Luca simply stared blankly at the tombstone. A somber and sorrowful atmosphere permeated the surroundings. Perhaps out of sympathy for the boy, even guests who were acquainted with Luca's parents did not choose to disturb him at this moment, only nodding occasionally when someone came forward to offer flowers. However, Luca's thoughts were not on the funeral at that moment. Although no official figures have been released for the Battle of New York, the actual death toll is considerable, so even though this is a high-end cemetery, there are still many families holding funerals. After all, the Chitauri don't distinguish between high and low status when it comes to guns and cannons. Now, a week has passed, and everything seems to have returned to normal. But in reality, New York City today, or more specifically the Midtown and Uptown areas of Manhattan, is still in complete chaos. Protests and marches in the streets, prayers by various politicians and charitable organizations, disinfection and reconstruction work in the disaster area, treatment of the wounded, burial of the dead. All sorts of follow-up matters surrounding the Battle of New York are still ongoing. Reality is far from what's depicted in movies, where heroes defeat the enemy and everything is fine. In fact, the most funny thing these days is the post-disaster reconstruction and compensation. The most central point of contention, and the main topics discussed in various television media, street protests, and congressional hearings these days, have all focused on whether this incident constitutes war damage, a natural disaster, or a terrorist attack. Indeed, 7 days have passed, and the debate remains focused on the most basic definition. The military is trying hard to define the Chitauri invasion as an alien war in order to expand its military influence through the Defense Production Act. Although this would require the Department of Defense to bear some compensation, under the emergency response measures, the military can also take over the alien technology debris in its entirety. Some capital groups, led by major insurance companies and bankers, want to define the intrusion as an alien terrorist attack, since terrorist attacks have been excluded from the coverage of all insurance companies since 2001. This allows them to avoid liability for damages while also providing a legitimate reason to refuse the government's request for low-interest loans to microenterprises and individuals. This allows funds to flow to the benign lending of other large companies. the situation is more complicated for the government. Although both the federal and state governments believe that the incident should be defined as a natural disaster, this would help to appease the public, win over voters, and gain international support. However, under the Stafford Act, the federal government is required to cover 90% of the reconstruction costs for national natural disasters, while only 75% is required for state-level natural disasters. The New York state government and the federal government are locked in a fierce debate on this issue. In short, Congress, the military, intelligence agencies, capital, and even the news media are currently involved. Some want to shift the blame, some want to cultivate their reputation and gain fame, and some want to take over the alien debris. Regardless of whether they are involved in the Battle of New York or not, everyone seems to want to get involved. Aside from the initial disaster relief efforts, it was actually Stark Industries' personal funds and supplies, along with aid from external international sources, that arrived first. The rest, including some individuals or small, unsavory groups, also focused their efforts on smuggling alien weapons. Yes, in fact, news of people using alien weapons to rob banks has been circulating in the past few days. Well, even Luca himself secretly hid some Chitauri weapons. Luca may later hand these weapons over to the company's weapons development department, allowing them to study them privately and see if there are any technologies that can be utilized. However, this is something every arms company does. As long as it's not openly used in public, even SHIELD won't cause trouble. It's just that the company's weapons development department was originally led by the father, Herman. Now that Herman's R&D department is gone, it's hard to say how much capability it still possesses. Moreover, Luca doesn't really have the authority to speak within his own company right now. Everything will have to wait until later. Young Master Luca. Seeing Luca staring blankly at the tombstone, Samira hesitated several times before finally whispering a reminder. Upon hearing this, Luca snapped out of his daze, took 2 steps forward, and put down the flowers in his hand. The death of his father may have brought a touch of sadness because of the surrounding environment, but in essence, Luca was more concerned about his own future. Just as Luca put down the flowers and was about to get up, but a hoarse, short, and unpleasant voice came from behind, which was quite inappropriate. Hee tilde Luca. My brother-in-law's funeral is such a big event, and you didn't even tell me. It really makes me sad. Everyone, including Luca, looked over at the sound. A middle-aged man wearing a black suit and with slightly disheveled hair was walking towards them. The newcomer bore a striking resemblance to Luca's mother, Gina. Compared to Gina's decisive and capable elite demeanor, the man in front of her was slightly hunched, stiff, and unsteady on his feet. Even though his clothes were clearly carefully made up, he still gave people the feeling of a monkey wearing a crown. Especially his pale, sickly face, with sunken eyes and a vacant yet greedy gaze, like a rat that had been starving in a sewer for a long time. Who is this person? Isn't he Ms. Orange's brother? I've seen him at the company before. I've never heard of this person before. Most of the guests who had begun to leave chose to stay and whisper among themselves. Even those few who were very close to the Orange family who wanted to step forward were pulled back by others and temporarily stopped. Of course, these people weren't entirely indifferent and looking forward to seeing others make a fool of themselves. Although the visitor seemed hostile, judging from the discussions of others, it seemed to be a family matter of the Orange family, and it was not appropriate for ordinary people to interfere rashly. As the middle-aged man in a suit approached, Luca's nostrils twitched slightly, and a deep look of disgust flashed in his eyes. Luca had seen far too many people like this in his previous life. He was all too familiar with them. Of course, there was no need for knowledge from the previous life. Although the original owner was young and did not know the person fully, he still had general information about him in his memories. Dragon Orange. Luca's mother Gina's younger brother, who is also Luca's uncle. A hopeless gambler. End of this chapter, Chapter 14 Uncle. Chapter 14, Uncle since the passing of Gina's parents, the previous heads of the Orange family. Gina came to the United States shortly after graduating from university, taking over the mess left by her parents. Besides the company that was struggling to develop in America at the time, there was also her younger brother, who had been good for nothing since childhood. At first, when her younger brother Dragon started to go astray, Gina thought about helping him back down. While strictly disciplining him, they also made sure he was employed within the company. However, Dragon not only failed to repent, but also became addicted to gambling. Despite several attempts to persuade him, he eventually concealed orders and secretly misappropriated company funds. Completely disappointed in him, Gina decisively kicked him out of the company, threw him a sum of money, and left him to fend for himself. Later, in the original owner's memory, she saw this rogue uncle several times, all when he came to the house asking for money and seeking help. However, for the past 2 years, Luca has not seen his mother Gina for a long time. No one knows what methods she used. Now it seems that it wasn't just gambling. The other party was even addicted to drugs. "Why are you here?" It wasn't Luca who spoke, but rather Samira, who was standing to the side with an unfriendly look in her eyes. At the same time, she stepped forward and shielded Luca behind her. It was clear that Samira understood the nature of the person in front of her. Of course, Dragon also knew Samira, and when he noticed her undisguised disgust, a nameless anger surged in his heart, but he immediately suppressed it. "Samira, don't forget I also have the surname Orange. In this situation, it's natural for me to be concerned about Luca." As he spoke, Dragon glanced at Luca's empty sleeves and the tombstone behind him. Noticing the disdain in the other person's eyes, Samira, who had watched Luca grow up, immediately became furious. On the contrary, Luca, who also noticed the other's gaze, did not show much change in expression. He got so caught up in the excitement of the previous New York game that he kicked his prosthetic arm like a ball. The prosthetic arm was actually a special mechanical arm custom-made by the original parents from Transia, an exoskeleton company that collaborates with the Department of Defense at great expense. Although it doesn't yet reach the sensitivity of a normal arm, it's already quite a sci-fi prosthetic. Right now, Luca can find a regular prosthetic hand to temporarily replace him, but that only makes him look more like a normal person and doesn't actually bring much convenience to his daily life. Luca decided against getting a new prosthesis installed for the time being and patiently waited for Terentia to remake it. Luca himself doesn't care about his disability, and he's unlikely to feel any anger because of other people's opinions. Luca gently pressed down on the somewhat impulsive Samira, then looked calmly at his uncle and said in a cold tone, "Uncle, I'll still call you that for now. Thank you for coming to my father's funeral. But I remember that mother seems to have severed ties with you a long time ago. As for Aunt Samira, I think she is much more trustworthy than some people." Upon hearing Luca's words, Dragon straightened up again. He straightened his collar and pretended to be concerned about his nephew. "Kid, New York state law doesn't recognize the concept of severing family ties. Besides, blood is thicker than water. Given your current situation, as your uncle, I definitely have to step in and take care of you." As he said this, Dragon pointed his chin at Samira with a provocative expression. Wasn't Gina just injured and unconscious? Are they trying to seize power? This guy thinks way too highly of himself, doesn't he? The guests began to murmur amongst themselves again. Clearly, most of them looked down on Dragon, who was obviously no good. He alone looked around at the guests with smug satisfaction. Samira, seemingly worried that Luca was too young to understand Dragon's character, was about to speak up to explain. Before Samira could say anything, Luca frowned slightly. Where did this guy get his information about Gina? Gina Orange, who is Luca's mother. He was injured and fell into a coma during the Battle of New York, and was sent to the hospital for treatment immediately after the battle ended. However, the doctor said that Gina is currently suffering from neural synaptic cocooning syndrome. This condition is essentially caused by continuous high-frequency energy shocks, which lead to the terminal nerves of the cerebral cortex being wrapped with abnormal proteins, resulting in a decrease in the efficiency of nerve signal transmission and the brain entering a semi-dormant state. This condition was extremely rare in the medical field, and the only recorded cases of patients were those who experienced symptoms such as slowed reaction, drowsiness, and forgetfulness. However, during this Battle of New York, more than a dozen wounded soldiers suddenly developed this symptom. Those with milder symptoms could barely manage to live independently, while those with more severe symptoms were pronounced dead after only a few days. On the contrary, for cases like Gina's, which are neither too serious nor too minor, neither the hospital nor the private medical team has any good treatment options, so they can only let it drag on. In fact, Luca had specifically sent the Samarations to invite Stephen Strange, the future Doctor Strange, in the past few days. This person should be considered the most outstanding neurosurgeon in all of New York right now. However, after hearing about the symptoms, the other party didn't even listen to the consultation fee quote and directly refused to see the doctor that Samira had asked for, citing that they were too busy with work recently. Now Luca can only follow the doctor's advice and choose conservative treatment to stabilize his condition in the hope that a new treatment plan will emerge. However, in theory, very few people know about this news right now. Dragon, who had disappeared for nearly 2 years and was addicted to gambling and drugs and was a complete waste of space. Where did he hear this news from? Seeing that the situation was about to get out of control, Luca immediately gave a cold order. Aunt Samira, send him away. Don't let him cause trouble at your father's funeral. Upon hearing this, Samira immediately stepped forward, grabbed Dragon's shoulder, and tried to lead him away from the scene. However, Dragon not only did not back down, but instead boasted smugly. HMPH, kid, are you scared? What about the law? If someone lacks civil capacity, the shareholders' meeting will be reopened to elect a decision-maker. As he spoke, Dragon's nostrils twitched, his pupils contracted slightly with excitement, and his speech became increasingly incoherent. Don't think you have absolute control. You haven't inherited those shares yet. At the shareholders' meeting, the dead and those in a vegetative state can't attend. What did you say, you bastard? Upon hearing this, Samira's eyes widened in anger, and she grabbed Dragon by the collar, lifting him up. Gina, in a vegetative state. Wasn't it said that Ms. Orange was only temporarily unconscious? Many of the guests had partnerships with Orange Industries or were even employees of the company. Upon hearing this news, they all looked at Luca with surprise and uncertainty. Luca, on the other hand, paid no attention to the stares of those people, but instead noticed the problem in Dragon's words, his voice as sharp as an ice pick. Shareholders meeting? What does that have to do with you? What makes you think you can influence the shareholders' decisions? End of this chapter, Chapter 15, Making Trouble. Chapter 15, Making Trouble. 2 of the Orange Group's minority shareholders were present today. Reminded by Luca, they immediately realized what was happening and looked at Dragon with hesitant expressions. You should know that when Dragon was ousted from the company, he didn't get a single share. He couldn't even attend the shareholders' meeting, let alone influence shareholder decisions. So why is he so confident now? Dragon's smile froze upon hearing this, and he unconsciously licked the corner of his mouth, his mind becoming even more confused. Kid, you'd better know your place. Dragon stopped talking abruptly, his shifty eyes seeming to have caught something. As if he had regained some of his senses, he was only breathing heavily, and he reached out desperately to pry open Samira's hand that was gripping his collar. You stray dog, let go of me. This is none of your business. However, how could his emaciated body, ravaged by drugs, possibly contend with Samira's strength? Seeing that the other party didn't seem to have any intention of saying anything more, Luca also gave up the idea of continuing to argue with him. This guy's brain has been ruined by drugs. He probably doesn't even know what he's trying to say, right? Luca waved for Samira to release the other woman and spoke coldly to Dragon. Get out, you're not welcome here. Upon hearing this, Dragon initially wanted to approach further, but upon noticing Samira's clenched fist, he immediately shrank back. Ignoring the strange looks from others, he left while cursing. However, with his departure, Luca will have to clean up the mess he left behind. The somber atmosphere of the funeral was completely dispelled. Several guests with close ties to Orange Industries immediately came forward to ask questions. Luca, is Lady Orange really not going to wake up? That's what that person just said. Clearly, as the true leader of Orange Industries, Gina Orange holds a significant place in the hearts of these people. If Gina runs into trouble, these partners may have to reconsider their collaborations. Seeing so many people gathering around, Luca first gestured to Samira that he was all right. He then took 2 steps forward, pressed his palms down, and spoke to everyone in a calm tone. I apologize for making this a laughing stock of you all. As for my mother, Ms. Gina, she has received effective treatment and may wake up at any time. If any changes occur, the company will issue an official announcement. Please remain calm. After saying this, Luca ignored the guests who looked at him strangely and pulled Samira straight to a corner. Many people, seeing how calm the 14-year-old boy was, did not continue to ask him any further questions. After all, as Luca said, instead of getting entangled here, they should wait for Orange Industries' official statement or inquire privately. It seems that even if they continue to press him here, the boy won't really reveal anything more to them. Meanwhile, after taking Samira aside, watching Dragon's swaying figure disappear into the distance, Luca whispered in Samira's ear, Aunt Samira, could you please follow them and check when they reach a secluded spot? Do you want to kill him? Hearing Samira's sudden interruption, Luca was immediately embarrassed. I never expected Samira to be so violent. That's his own uncle. However, it doesn't seem like it's entirely impossible. After a moment's hesitation, Luca decided to proceed at his own pace. Find an opportunity to catch him, find out why he's here today, and if there's anything going on, break his arms and legs and bring him back so we can decide what to do next. If it weren't for the large number of people at the funeral, most of whom were wealthy and influential, and the potential for trouble if they caused a disturbance, Luca wouldn't have let the other person leave. The reason we're having Samira follow along right now is to figure out why this drug-addicted idiot dares to provoke us. However, it was Samira who began to hesitate. Young Master Luca, you're all alone here. Luca simply shook his head slightly upon hearing this. It's okay, there are so many people here, I won't leave easily. And, as he spoke, Luca patted his waist and continued. It's not that I'm without the ability to protect myself. Hurry up, it will be harder to track him down if he goes too far away. Upon hearing this, Samira nodded heavily and then quickly followed Dragon's departing steps from the side. Although some guests who had been watching the scene noticed Samira's actions, no one spoke up at this moment. Watching the 2 figures disappear into the distance, Luca fell into deep thought. Luca certainly attaches great importance to his own company. His own cheat ability appears to be a synthesized tool. With the company's funding and distribution channels, collecting core components and synthesizing the necessary materials will be much easier in the future. Not to mention that their own company is a weapons company. If we could control the talent, laboratories, and industrial equipment in those research departments, it's not impossible that in the future, reverse engineering props for mass production and expanding the company's scale is feasible. Luca had this intention in mind when he kept the 2 sticky missiles from the pencil missiles. However, Luca is only 14 years old now. Orange Industrial was always managed by the mother, Gina, while the father, Herman, was in charge of scientific research. At such a young age, Luca had little opportunity to be involved in the affairs of those companies. With the father dead, the mother in a coma, and 2 other minority shareholders killed in the Battle of New York, the company has essentially been at a standstill for the past week. The whole of New York was in a state of panic. It was fortunate that Orange Industrial was able to operate smoothly, and no one took the lead in proposing to hold a shareholders' meeting to change management. This also involves issues related to Luca's inheritance and changes in company equity. Typically, the process of Luca inheriting his father's estate can take up to a year, involving many aspects such as will determination, property liquidation, tax audit, and court judgment. Part of the father's estate will go to the mother, Gina. Although Gina is still in a coma, as long as doctors do not diagnose her as a vegetable or that she will never wake up, she will naturally have the right to inherit the estate. If he is diagnosed as being in a vegetative state, according to the will that the two had prepared long ago, both estates will be inherited by Luca. However, this means that 14-year-old Luca may have to consider the issue of his guardian. This may also involve many complicated issues such as estate supervision, trust fund involvement, and nominee shareholding. That cheap, idiotic uncle of mine, he wouldn't be trying to fight for custody of me, would he? End of this chapter. Chapter 16 Tony and #039's gift. Chapter 16 Tony's gift. The idea of fighting for custody had barely surfaced when Luca rejected it himself. Not to mention that Gina, the mother, is currently only in a coma and has not yet lost custody of her. Although it seems highly likely that Gina will eventually be diagnosed as being in a vegetative state. However, even if it were to be implemented immediately, Dragon, an uncle with a history of gambling and drug use, would be a concern. Once this is exposed, even if the court ultimately awards guardianship to the Child Welfare Bureau or a family trust, it will not fall into his hands. Even if he were to gain guardianship, the company's shareholders would not allow such a person to manage the company. Perhaps we should try to collect some medical-grade crafting items to try and revive Gina. If my guess is correct regarding the golden finger, or cheat code, then there should be quite a few technological gadgets in the medical field as well. Setting aside this uncertainty for the time being, Luca immediately changed his thinking. Where does Dragon get his confidence? How dare he so confidently claim he can influence the board? He can't possibly be relying on family ties to hold shares on behalf of others and control decision-making, can he? Aside from that, he has nothing to do with the board of directors or the entire company right now, let alone the company. Did they acquire the shares privately, and where did the money come from? Luca had seen too many gamblers and drug addicts like this in his previous life, and he didn't believe that someone like this could turn his life around with that money in less than 2 years. Even if the other party didn't go bankrupt and become heavily in debt, Luca believed that the other party had reformed. What methods were used to persuade the other shareholders? Or is there someone backing them up? Having little experience with the company's business, Luca was overwhelmed with thoughts but couldn't quite make sense of them. It seems we can only wait until Samira deals with this uncle first, and then see if we can pry any information out of him. Now Luca is actually quite grateful that this idiot took the initiative to expose himself instead of secretly causing trouble in the shadows. This guy, whose brain has been sluggish, could have easily stayed hidden, but instead he deliberately exposed himself to fight. No, that doesn't seem to suggest that this guy has someone backing him up. Just as Luca was thinking rapidly, the sound of high heels clicking on the ground slowly approached from afar. Meanwhile, because of the farce that had just happened, gasps of surprise were heard from the guests who were supposed to be leaving. Luca instinctively reached for his waist and quickly turned around. However, after seeing who it was, his face changed to one of confusion. "Mr. Orange, hello. I am here today on Tony's instructions." The newcomer was tall and had a capable demeanor. As she walked, almost everyone kept their eyes fixed on her. Even those attending other funerals nearby cast their gazes in this direction. Of course, this was not because of her outstanding appearance, but more because of the identity of the person who came. Those who came to attend the funeral in the vicinity were all wealthy and influential, and many people recognized the person immediately. The true managers of Stark Industries today. Ms. Pepperpotts. Looking at Tony Stark's official girlfriend, the famous Pepper Potts, Luca spoke softly with a strange expression. Pepper, after scrutinizing Luca's excessively youthful appearance, felt a softening in her eyes. In fact, she did come here on Tony's orders. However, since there was no funeral invitation, Pepper had originally planned to meet Luca outside the cemetery and convey Tony's condolences. But after noticing the commotion earlier, Pepper Potts decided to venture inside. However, upon arrival, he saw all the guests leaving on their own, while the one-armed boy stood alone in front of the tombstone, lost in thought. Even Pepper Potts, a career woman known for her competence and decisiveness, couldn't help but feel pity at this moment, and her tone softened a bit. Tony told me that you provided him with a lot of help during the Battle of New York. I was sent here this time, firstly because I feel sorry for what happened to the Orange family, and secondly to express my gratitude for your previous help. Those guests who had initially had second thoughts, because of Dragon's earlier outburst, all looked at Luca with envy after hearing Pepperpot's words. This is the CEO of Stark Industries, and he's bringing thanks from Tony Stark, the Iron Man. It's worth noting that even after Stark Industries closed its weapons division, its relationship with the government and military may no longer be as harmonious. However, even with Stark Industries' immense wealth and innovative pioneering work in the energy sector, it remains at the very top of the pyramid to this day. Not to mention, Tony Stark's identity as Iron Man has truly saved the entire city of New York. With the other party's favor, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that a company the size of Orange Industries could take off immediately. Luca himself, however, showed no excitement at the moment, since in his eyes these were just familiar movie characters from the original story. Even though he was very clear about the power that Chili Pepper represented, he found it hard to feel any awe in the face of these familiar strangers, and simply waved his hand politely and said, "It was an honor for me that Ms. Potts could attend my father's funeral. There was really no need for thanks." However, looking at the polite young man in front of him, Pepper Potts simply shook his head and waved his hand behind him. Immediately afterward, a slightly overweight man in a suit, carrying a long briefcase and looking more like a director than a bodyguard, came running up, panting heavily. The person who arrived was none other than Tony Stark's personal bodyguard, Happy Hogan. Happy handed the long suitcase to Luca and then remained silent. Pepper continued softly. "Tony has been tied up with the disaster reconstruction work these days and can't get away. This is a gift he asked me to bring to you." Luca took the suitcase with some confusion, his face full of bewilderment. Giving gifts at a funeral. Seeing this, Pepper carefully glanced at Luca's severed arm and said softly, "You can open it and take a look. I think it might be helpful to you." Pepperpot spoke softly, but he did not make any attempt to avoid being seen by others. At this moment, many people looked on in surprise, trying to see what gift the famous Tony Stark had given Luca that even required Pepperpots to personally intervene. However, out of courtesy, these people could only stand still and stick their heads out. Upon hearing this, Luca did not hesitate any longer. I simply placed the suitcase on the seat and gently pressed the latch to open it. Upon opening the lid, a long arm was prominently displayed in the center of the gold thread lining inside the suitcase. The fine texture and completely realistic arm skin look exactly like Luca's left hand, except that the palm is facing the opposite direction. If it weren't for the dark, gaping joint at the elbow, Luca would have thought it was a real arm. And more importantly, at this moment, Luca saw that the arm was emitting a faint white light that only he could see. End of this chapter. Chapter 17, Sweet Captive. Chapter 17, Sweet Captive reach out and take the prosthetic limb out of the box. It's unclear what material this arm is made of, but it's quite lightweight, and the skin on its surface even has a texture almost like a real arm. Of course, more importantly, upon contact, a light blue, semi-transparent panel immediately pops out. Sweet Captive Devil May Cry World 1/5 Creator. Nicoletta Goldstein Core Component. Simulated mechanical prosthetic limb synthetic consumables. 1 small hook launcher, 1 small hydraulic transmission rod, 1 miniature therapeutic device, 1 vibrator item description. This is a gentle prosthetic hand, also known as the Happy Hand of Kyrie. It was specially designed and made by Nicoletta for the usually careless Nero, possessing dexterity exceeding that of a real hand. The material is soft and won't harm the skin, and the vibration function relieves pain. Friendly reminder: don't get the wrong idea, this prosthetic hand can actually treat injuries. Luca's gaze swept quickly across the information on the panel, and his expression immediately became very strange. What the hell is Sweet Captive? What kind of kind person would consider this feature when making a prosthetic limb? And what's more, isn't Devil May Cry an action game? Luca, who had only heard of the Devil May Cry series but had never played it, clearly couldn't understand the game developer's thought process. Considering his current persona of having just lost his father, Luca suppressed his inner urge to rant and rave, trying his best to remain outwardly calm and sincerely expressing his gratitude to Pepper Potts. "Thank you very much. Actually, my help to Mr. Stark was insignificant. I didn't expect him to remember me." As he spoke, Luca simply rolled up his sleeves and, in front of everyone, pressed the prosthetic limb onto the broken part of his right arm without hesitation. Perhaps during their last meeting, Tony's AI scanned his data. The arm fits it remarkably well. In fact, if one doesn't pay close attention to the amputation joint, it's difficult to distinguish it from a normal arm at first glance. Furthermore, the design for neural sensing is also perfect. Luca moved his arms and fingers with ease and felt almost no sluggishness. The direction of movement was also different from that of a normal prosthetic arm, which can only grasp. Clearly, Tony Stark put a lot of thought and effort into making this gift. However, perhaps taking into account Luca's identity as a teenager, this mechanical prosthetic arm is simply a full-body simulation of a normal arm. Not only does it lack any additional functions, but its maximum output is also no different from that of a normal arm. More effort was put into simulation and ease of use. Of course, for ordinary people, such a prosthetic limb is perfectly adequate. Although Luca will probably use it as material to synthesize later, at least for now, having this arm will make his daily life much more convenient. "Mr. Stark, thank you for your trouble. I don't know how to thank you enough." Although he didn't expect Tony Stark to be so interested, Luca didn't mind getting this super-rich man for free. He was completely unambiguous when it came to expressing his gratitude and saying a few polite words. Seeing that Luca was pleased with Tony's gift, Pepper also showed a hint of satisfaction. Having learned about the boy's situation beforehand, she believed that if Tony's gift could temporarily alleviate the boy's grief over the death of his loved ones, then her trip would not have been in vain. Moreover, after meeting the boy in person, she found him to be so polite and sensible, which made her admire him even more. "I will convey Mr. Luca's gratitude to you, but there's no need to take it too seriously. The fact that you like this gift is the best news for Tony." Thinking of Tony, who seemed to have become inexplicably anxious since the Battle of New York and had been immersing himself in his work, Pepper Potts sighed silently. Setting aside his worries about Tony for the time being, Pepper Potts took out 2 business cards from his handbag and handed them to Luca. "These are my and Tony's business cards. Tony specifically told me that Stark Industries will provide a lifetime warranty on this prosthetic limb, and that I can contact him anytime if it needs to be replaced or repaired." After thinking for a moment, Pepper Potts added softly, "If you need any other help, you can contact me or Tony directly." These words drew another gasp of astonishment from those around them. Upon hearing Pepper Potts's very sincere tone, Luca solemnly accepted the 2 gold-embossed business cards. "I never imagined that Tony Stark could achieve this much after only 2 previous encounters. It seems that, apart from his somewhat unlikable way of speaking and personality, Tony Stark is otherwise impeccable." Recalling Tony Stark's style of doing things in the movie, Luca didn't say much. He first expressed his gratitude and then readily put away the 2 business cards. In fact, regardless of whether this help is used or not, the fact that Pepper Potts made this promise in front of so many people today already carries significant weight. Given the size of Stark Industries and the social standing of Tony and Pepper, even if it's just a case of them using Stark's influence, it would be of immense benefit to their future development. After expressing her condolences once again for the passing of Luca's father, Chili Peppers excused herself and left, citing other work commitments. As soon as she left, all the guests who had been holding back immediately followed her. Some people came up to hand over their business cards, while others simply wanted to say a few words and show their faces. In short, the entire funeral site became empty in an instant. Watching these people leave, Luca shook his head with a sneer. Relying on the lingering influence of others is too superficial. Ultimately, only one's own strength can bring status. After watching everyone leave, Luca looked again at the empty suitcase in front of him. Whether Tony Stark did this intentionally or not, there was not only a simple instruction manual and maintenance booklet, but also a separate USB drive. The USB drive's attachment clearly states learning materials, indicating that it contains detailed information about the entire manufacturing process and procedures for this mechanical prosthesis. Tony Stark surely doesn't think I could understand or create such a high-tech, lifelike arm, does he? Although Luca himself felt that his 14-year-old brain was indeed very sharp. In addition, thanks to the education and guidance of her father from a young age, she had a certain amount of knowledge about electrical machinery. But at best, he's only at the level of participating in a robotics competition. Given the complexity of this mechanical prosthetic, even with the complete process, he couldn't possibly have made it by hand. Well, the company's research department is now basically paralyzed after losing its leader, Herman. Even if the researchers in the research department were given the complete data, it would probably be quite difficult for them to perfectly replicate it. Just as Luca was pondering these things. The other side. Samira, however, encountered a small problem. End of this chapter. Chapter 18 screwed up. Chapter 18 screwed up. Previously, at Luca's behest, Samira followed Dragon to a secluded corner on the edge of the cemetery. I'm going to teach this bastard a lesson and try to get him to tell me why he caused all this trouble. This wasn't the first time Samira had done something like this. However, in the past, this was mostly done under the orders of Luca's mother, Gina. With the head of the family currently in a coma, and the master deceased, Samira herself did not feel there was anything wrong with Luca taking the lead. The only thing that worried her was that it seemed a bit too cruel to make the young master, who had a kind personality and rarely had any involvement in such family matters, act mature and handle everything now. On the contrary, Samira felt no unease at all about dealing with this good-for-nothing who had almost become the head of the family. If it weren't for Luca's earlier instructions, Samira would have even considered secretly killing this bastard to end it all. Seeing that no one was around, Samira quickly bent down and pulled a gleaming dagger from her boot. He then caught up with Dragon in a few strides, kicked him to the ground, and held a dagger to his neck. What? Just as Dragon was about to shout in panic, Samira's rough hand was pressed firmly against his mouth. This silenced all his subsequent screams. Seeing Dragon, who had completely lost his previous arrogance, Samira pressed her dagger down slightly, her tone sharp. You should know what I want to ask, right? A sharp dagger was pressed against his neck, and bright red blood immediately flowed out. At this moment, Dragon was no longer the arrogant and domineering man he once was. His already lifeless eyes were now filled with terror. It was hard to tell whether his pale face was from being frightened or simply from being too weak. It struggled desperately, making continuous woo-woo sounds. Seeing this, Samira raised her hand, signaling the other party to speak. Dragon, already somewhat terrified, didn't even dare to shout for help, but instead questioned her in a trembling voice. You, what do you think you're doing? I'm also the heir to the Orange family. Samira looked disdainful upon hearing this, but did not lessen the force in her hand. Dragon, for the sake of the lady, speak your mind. Before Samira could finish her sentence, the perceptive Samira noticed that Dragon, who had been looking terrified, suddenly relaxed and stared intently behind her. Without uttering a single unnecessary word, Samira immediately bent over and rolled to the side. The next moment, a tiny crater exploded where Samira had been standing. Then several faint gunshots followed. Samira rolled rapidly until she reached an unmarked tombstone, where she stopped to catch her breath. Choo-choo-choo. The continuous gunfire suppressed the noise, sending stones flying from the rather ornate tombstone. 3 enemies, P226, silencer, subsonic rounds. Based on the sound and bullet holes, Samira quickly determined the enemy's location, while simultaneously reaching into her bosom. As a bodyguard, she naturally carried a firearm, but unlike the other person, she did not have a silencer. Samira's mind raced, and she quickly made a decision. As the sound of the tombstones cracking behind her gradually subsided, Samira's muscles tensed immediately, and she burst out of the cover like a powerful female leopard. His hawk-like gaze swept quickly across the distance. 3 armed enemies dressed in black suits were present. One was still firing, another was reloading, and the last was roughly dragging the scrambling dragon away, covering his escape. Seeing this, Samira used the arch of her foot to exert force, and quickly dodged to the side in succession. He ignored the man in black, who was still shooting, and let the bullets whiz past him. At the same time, his forearm, veins bulging, exerted a sudden force. Whoosh! The dagger was thrown out rapidly. Like a sharp sword slicing through the air, it struck the black-clad man reloading his ammunition without hesitation, right in the face. PFFD. Blood splattered everywhere. The man didn't even have time to let out a scream before he fell backward. At that moment, the man in black who had been shooting continuously also emptied his magazine. He didn't even glance at the man in black, who was still futilely pulling the trigger. Samira exerted force with her feet again. The decaying leaves burst open behind me. The agile Samira quickly rushed toward Dragon, who was being dragged away. However, she had only taken 2 steps when her expression changed slightly. It wasn't because the man supporting Dragon pulled out a pistol to return fire. At that moment, 3 more men in black, armed with guns, appeared in the distant dense forest and aimed at him. Samira was currently 7 or 8 steps away from Dragon and his companion, and there was no time for her to rush close and rely on close combat to make the enemy hesitate to attack. He immediately ducked down and hid behind another piece of cover. Bullets rained down on the outside of the bunker with a whoosh 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 sound. Samira had no choice but to reach for the pistol in her bosom again. However, this time, when she peeked out from behind cover and raised her gun to aim, all that could be seen was the last man in black, dragging the corpse she had killed with her throwing knife back into the dense forest. The others had already disappeared into the dense forest. The arm muscles tensed and then relaxed. Samira ultimately did not choose to pull the trigger. Although the location is concealed, the sound of his gunshot could attract the attention of others and cause unnecessary trouble. She wasn't sure she could escape unscathed. Moreover, since the enemy is so openly using firearms, she must get to Luca's side quickly to protect him. After waiting a moment behind cover and confirming that all the enemies had left, Samira put her pistol away and quickly got up to head towards Luca. The other side, Dragon, who had just been rescued, was dragged and pulled into a stretch Lincoln by a man in black. The men in black who had been protecting him did not get into the car. The car door closed gently. Dragon, still shaken, gasped for breath, but dared not look at the refined young man sitting opposite him in the carriage. "Mr. Orange, it seems you've messed things up." The speaker was dressed in a smart and neat black suit, with square black-rimmed glasses on his face, exuding the aura of a financial elite. However, his casual remark caused Dragon, who was already terrified, to tremble uncontrollably. "Obviously this isn't my fault, it's that brat Luca's fault, it's all his fault, he doesn't even acknowledge me as his uncle." Dragon grew increasingly angry as he spoke, as if he had completely forgotten his previous irrational behavior. "Really? Why is it that my subordinates report that you haven't shown any interest in getting close to him at all?" End of this chapter. Chapter 19, Assassination Squad. Chapter 19, Assassination Squad. Seeing Dragon's trembling appearance, the man in front of him asked in a gentle voice, "It seems that your relationship with your nephew isn't as good as you say." Upon hearing this, Dragon quickly shook his head, his face full of a fawning smile that he himself was unaware of. "He's just a kid, what does he know? Next time, I'm sure I can convince him next time." Hearing the contradictory statements from the other party, Wesley simply shook his head calmly. If this guy, whose brain has been ruined by drugging, weren't still of some use, he wouldn't say a word to him. Well, in fact, he doesn't want to waste any more words now. Wesley casually opened the car door and beckoned to the 2 men in suits who were still waiting outside. "Take him away, don't let him run around." Upon hearing this, Dragon seemed to realize something and his mind cleared up instantly. While struggling to break free from the men in black, He clung to the car door and begged for mercy. "Wesley, trust me, give me another chance. I'm sure I can convince that kid. Once I take over the company, I will definitely pay back the money I owe you. Twice, no, 3 times. I'll give you 3 times back." However, Wesley completely ignored Dragon's pleas for mercy. After glancing at Dragon's soaked trousers, he continued to give orders with a hint of disgust. "Go change this guy's pants and clean him up." After saying that, without paying any attention to Dragon being dragged out of the carriage while trembling, he took out a handkerchief to cover his nose and then took out his phone to make a call. "Boss." How did things go? On the other end of the phone was a deep male voice. Wesley subconsciously put down his handkerchief, straightened his collar, and sat up straight before respectfully replying. "Dragon messed up, one of us died. But the body wasn't found, so we shouldn't be able to trace our presence for now." There was still silence on the other end of the phone. Wesley hesitated for a moment before adding more. "After that, I will first contact his mother's attending physician and ask them to postpone issuing the diagnosis and make a judgment based on the possibility that the condition might improve. This should delay the inheritance and the start of the board meeting." This time, the person on the other end of the phone finally spoke again, but there was no emotion in their voice. "Do it your way." After a slight pause, the man continued to give instructions. "I have received information that someone in the Upper East Side has reached an agreement with the government to participate in the recovery of alien debris. Policies may change at any time, and we must get things sorted out in the Central District as soon as possible." Hearing the dial tone from the other end of the phone, Wesley finally breathed a sigh of relief. "Gently wipe the phone screen and put it in your pocket." He then glanced at the spot where Dragon had been sitting, frowned slightly, and gave the order in a cold tone. "Let's go to the car wash." The car started and drove smoothly into the distance. Meanwhile, Luca, also inside the car, was listening to Samira's report. "It seems my uncle has indeed found some powerful backer." Feeling the mechanical prosthetic limb he had just been fitted with, Luca quietly pondered the ordeal Samira had recounted. Young Master Luca, the other side sent out 6 gunmen at once, which is clearly an organized group. "I suggest that while investigating who Dragon has recently been in contact with, we should also strengthen your security team." Although Samira believed that she could easily take down those 6 enemies in a head-on fight, even if there were twice as many, if they were using firearms, killing the enemy and protecting her own people were not the same thing, and she couldn't guarantee that she could stay by Luca's side all the time. Now that we know someone is spying on us in the dark, we should take precautions in advance. Luca had no objection to this, nor did he believe that having a few special gadgets would be enough to handle every crisis. In situations like this, expanding the security team was undoubtedly a wise choice. However, it's currently proving difficult for Luca to utilize the company's security forces. Does Aunt Samira have any suitable helper recommendations? Luca's idea was to spend some money to find a suitable security company to use temporarily. Although the company's funds are unavailable, the family has considerable assets through other investments such as funds. Unexpectedly, upon hearing Luca's words, Samira hesitated slightly and whispered, "Actually." Seeing Samira's hesitant manner, Luca was somewhat puzzled, but still gestured for her to continue. "Actually, the lady also has a private combat squad under her command. It is not large, but all of them are elites." Seeing Luca's puzzled expression in the rearview mirror, she continued to explain. "This team is nominally the company's weapons testers, but they also take on some odd jobs overseas from time to time." Nominally, Samira's words immediately piqued Luca's curiosity. Yes, mainly to make it easier for them to obtain equipment and move around. Well, in fact, usually, things that the lady can't handle herself are left to them to take care of. Hiss. Although Samira's words were quite vague, Luca had already understood what she meant. Good heavens, an assassination squad. Are arms dealers' business battles this realistic? Unexpectedly, the mother in the original owner's memories, who was gentle and considerate at home and a strong career woman outside, actually had such a power in secret. However, upon further reflection on the way American capital operates, Luca seemed to think that he might be making a mountain out of a molehill. Are these people trustworthy? Well, that's a somewhat redundant question. Trust should be the most basic requirement for someone willing to do these shady things for the Orange family. However, the current situation is special. Luca himself, whether due to his age or his familiarity with the team, must bring these matters to the forefront to reconfirm them before he can feel at ease. What if they look down on him as the young master and have other ulterior motives? Calling them back to protect you would be like inviting a wolf into your house. However, Samira responded firmly upon hearing this. Young master, please rest assured. All the members of this squad are veterans from the Sokovia battlefield. Hearing the name Sokovia reassured Luca somewhat. As for why the soldiers of the Sokovia army are trustworthy, we have to start with the Orange family's origins. Luca's parents were not traditional American residents. Based on what Samira has said these past few days, and piecing together the information from the original owner's memories, Luca's father, the deceased Herman Vaughn, had a relatively simple background. He was of mixed Chinese and Italian descent, with both his parents being immigrants from previous generations. In more traditional terms, Herman was considered to have married into the Orange family. In contrast, the situation of the mother, Gina Orange, is more complicated. End of this chapter, Chapter 20, The Orange House. Chapter 20, The Orange House. Although Gina Orange is of Sokovian and American descent, she grew up in Sokovia. In fact, the House of Orange was once a long-established and powerful force in Sokovia. The family itself is a hereditary baronial family, and going further back, there is even royal blood. However, the Tsarist monarchy is no longer in use in Sokovia today. Its official name in the international community is the Republic of Sokovia. Moreover, Sokovia has been in a state of constant warlordism. The instigation and interference of various forces have meant that this small Eastern European country has hardly had a few peaceful days. The official leader was nothing more than an even bigger warlord. The family's accumulated wealth over hundreds of years has given them a higher status and more resources in the country. But compared to those eagles and wolves from outside, they are ultimately no match for them. Gina's father, who was also Luca's maternal grandfather, suffered from various forms of exclusion and suppression within Sokovia. After much reflection, he decided to go to America to develop his career. While transferring large sums of money overseas, they also established Orange Industries in the United States. Gina even spent her entire college career in the United States. Gina and Herman met and fell in love while studying at MIT. However, the entry of outsiders is not as easy as imagined. After the initial phase of aggressive expansion through spending money, the commercial development of Orange County essentially stagnated and even regressed. But by then, if they wanted to return to Sokovia to manage their ancestral property, there was no longer a place for them in the country. That is, until Luca's maternal grandparents both died in an accident. Gina, who had just married Herman, resolutely took over the company and decided to go all in, completely abandoning everything her family had built in Sokovia over the centuries and plunging headlong into the quagmire of American capitalism. Fortunately, with Gina's excellent management skills and Herman's outstanding research capabilities, Orange Industries finally gained a foothold and gradually got back on track. Especially a few years ago, thanks to the analytical chip patent developed by Herman, the company successfully secured a weapon parts manufacturing order from Stark Industries, which put the company on a path of rapid development. The whole family moved to New York along with the company headquarters. Of course, what happened later, when a playboy suddenly realized his mistake and completely shut down the weapons department, causing not only a large number of his own employees to lose their jobs, but also severely damaging the entire downstream industry chain. Orange Industries, which had already begun to transform and replaced 70% of its factories with custom equipment, almost went bankrupt. But that's another story. In fact, after Stark Industries canceled its order 4 years ago, Gina used her connections to reach a cooperation agreement with Hammer Industries, which was rapidly growing at the time due to receiving a lot of blank resources. Yes, everyone knows the outcome of Hammer Industries. 2 years ago, Justin Hammer, the founder of Hammer Industries, was imprisoned because his self-developed combat robot army went berserk at the Stark Tech Expo. Most of his businesses were seized by the military and rival companies, leaving him with only the name and shell of a company, barely clinging to life. Orange Industrial, being a small fry, was naturally affected once again. In short, Luca, who has gained a deeper understanding of his company through Samira these past few days, can only say, the fact that she didn't bankrupt the company shows how incredibly capable her mother, Gina, truly is. The topic has gone a bit off topic. Although the family has been developing entirely in the United States in recent years, they have almost no influence in Sokovia. But centuries of accumulation cannot be so easily erased. Moreover, Gina, who grew up in Sokovia, had served in the Sokovian military before taking over the company after graduating from university. Whether they are former comrades in arms or trusted confidants secretly cultivated by the family, having a few absolutely trustworthy and loyal subordinates is really not a big deal. Just like Samira, who not only followed the Orange family for generations, but was also Gina's comrade in arms in the army. During this time, apart from the information and materials left by his parents, Luca learned a lot of things with the help of his Aunt Samira. Of course, it's also possible that this team is only known to Samira. Luca speculated that there might be other, more hidden plans, but it was still unknown because Gina was temporarily out of contact due to her coma. Now that he had determined that these people could be trusted, he did not hesitate any longer. Luca has always believed that trust, once a certain foundation is established, can be solidified entirely through time and shared interests. So he simply asked Samira directly, "How long will it take for these people to arrive? Do we need to prepare identification and equipment for them?" After all, as Samira mentioned before, this team usually spends most of their time operating overseas. If they can't get back in time, I can't just leave the bodyguard team idle just to wait for them. This time, however, Samira responded quickly. At the latest, it will be 3 days. Those guys have been active on the Mexican border recently, and if things go as fast as they do, they may all be in place by tomorrow. Actually, they had been following the news in New York before, and they even contacted me after they couldn't reach my wife. However, the lady's condition is still uncertain, so my advice to them is to remain on standby. Seemingly afraid that Luca might misunderstand, Samira added another sentence. I don't have the authority to directly command them. I only contact them occasionally on behalf of my wife to carry out missions together, which is why they took the initiative to contact me after losing contact this time. Luca nodded upon hearing this. He also knew that Samira probably wasn't sure about her mother's condition before and wanted to postpone unimportant matters until Gina woke up before making a decision. That's why they didn't tell him directly. However, upon hearing Samira mention carrying out the mission together, Luca's lips twitched again. Let's first arrange for someone to investigate the background of the group that was protecting my uncle. I will try to go out less these few days, and remember to arrange for 2 people to protect my mother. In addition, the meetings with the trust fund and lawyer who came to me earlier will be postponed for a few days. They will contact me again after this matter is over. While methodically arranging the follow-up procedures, Luca took out his phone to check the information. However, the next moment, the car, which had been moving smoothly, suddenly braked sharply. The sharp, piercing sound of tires screeching filled my ears. At the same time, he also heard Samira's slightly hurried shouts. "Master, be careful." End of this chapter. All right, legends, that's it for today. If you're ready for the next chapter, smash that like button and flood the comments right now. Remember, we've got 3 days to prove this story needs to continue. Subscribe so you don't miss the drop, and I'll meet you in the next audiobook.